Welcome to the Rainy Night Storyteller. Tonight, as rain whispers against your window, I invite you into a world where shadows hold secrets and the ordinary turns extraordinary. Our tale this evening, The Scarecrow and Other Stories by G. Ranger Wormser, will lead you into the eerie depths of a mysterious field, where a lifeless scarecrow may not be as still as it seems. Curious? Then stay with me. And while you're here, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Rainy Night Storyteller, and tap the notification bell for more enchanting and haunting stories. Now, let's begin. The Scarecrow. Ben. The woman stood in the doorway of the ramshackle, tumble-down shanty. Her hands were cupped at her mouth. The wind blew loose, whitish blonde wisps of hair around her face and slashed the faded blue dress into the uncorseted bulk of her body. Benny. Oh, Benny. Her call echoed through the still evening. Her eyes staring straight before her down the slope in front of the house caught sight of something blue and antiquatedly military standing waist-deep and rigid in the cornfield. That old scarecrow, she muttered to herself, that their old scarecrow with their old uniform onto him, too. The sun was going slowly just beyond the farthest hill. The unreal light of the skies reflected colors held over the yellow, waving tips of the cornfield. Benny, she called again. Oh, Benny. And then she saw him coming toward her, trudging up the hill. She waited until he stood in front of her. Supper, Ben, she said. Was you down in the south meadow where you couldn't hear me call? Nah. He was young and slight. He had thick hair and a thin face. His features were small. There was nothing unusual about them. His eyes were deep-set and long, with the lids that were heavily fringed. You heard me calling you? Yes, Ma. He stood there straight and still. His eyelids were lowered. Why ain't you come along then? What ails you, Benny, letting me shout and shout that way? Nothing, Ma. Where was you? He hesitated a second before answering her. I was to the bottom of the hill. And what was you doing down there to the bottom of the hill? What was you doing down there, Benny? Her voice had a hushed tenseness to it. I was watching, Ma. Watching, Benny? That's what I was doing. His tone held a guarded sullenness. Tain't no such a pretty sunset, Benny. Warn't watching no sunset. Benny. Well, he spoke quickly. What you want to put it there for? What you want to do that for in the first place? There was birds, Benny. You know there was birds. That ain't what I mean. What for you put on that their uniform? I ain't had nothing else. There warn't nothing but your granddad's old uniform. It's fair in rags, Benny. It's all I had to put onto it. Well, you done it yourself. Nah, Benny, nah. Tain't nothing but an old uniform with a stick into it, just to frighten off them birds. Tain't nothing else. Honest, tain't, Benny. He looked up at her out of the corners of his eyes. It was waving its arms. That's the wind. Nah, Ma. Waving its arms before the wind had come up. Sush, Benny. Tain't likely. Tain't. I was watching, Ma. I seen it wave and wave. S'pose it should beckon. I s'pose it should beckon to me. I'd be going then, Ma. Sush, Benny. I'd fair have to go, Ma. Leave your mammy? Nah, Ben. Nah. You couldn't never go off and leave your mammy. Even if you ain't able to bear this here farm, you couldn't go off from your mammy. You couldn't. Not your Ma, Benny. She could see his mouth twitch. She saw him catch his lower lip and under his teeth. Ah. Say you couldn't leave, Benny. Say it. I fair hate this here farm. He mumbled. Morning and night. And morning and night. Nothing but chores and earth. And then some more of them chores. And always that their way. So it is. Always. And the stillness. Nothing alive. Nothing. Sometimes I ain't able to stand it nohow. Sometimes. You'll get to like it. Later, Meb. Nah. Nah, Ma. You will, Benny. Sure you will. I won't never. I ain't able to help fretting. It's all closed up tight inside of me. Eating and eating. It makes me feel sick. She put out a hand and laid it heavily on his shoulder. Likely it's a touch of fever in the blood, Benny. Ah, I ain't got no fever. You'll be feeling better in the morning, Ben. I'll be feeling the same, Ma. That's just it. Always the same. Nothing but the stillness. Nothing alive. And down there in the cornfield, that ain't alive, Benny. Ain't it, Ma? Don't say that, Benny. Don't. He shook her hand off of him. I was watching, he said doggedly. I seen it wave and wave. She turned into the house. That old Scarecrow. She muttered to herself. That there old Scarecrow. She led the way into the kitchen. The boy followed at her heels. A lamp was lighted on the center table. The one window was uncurtained. Through the naked spot of it, the evening glow poured shimmeringly into the room. Inside the doorway, they both paused. You sit down, Benny. He pulled a chair up to the table. She took a steaming pot from the stove and, emptying it into a plate, placed the dish before him. He fell to eating silently. She came and sat opposite him. She watched him cautiously. She did not want him to know that she was watching him. Whenever he glanced up, she hurried her eyes away from his face. In the stillness, the only live things were those two pair of eyes darting away from each other. Benny. She could not stand it any longer. Benny, just you. Just you? He gulped down a mouthful of food. Ah, Ma, don't you start nothing. Not no more tonight, Ma. She half rose from her chair. For a second, she leaned stiffly against the table. Then she slipped back into her seat, her whole body limp and relaxed. I ain't going to start nothing, Benny. I ain't even going to talk about this here farm. Honest, I ain't. Ah, this here farm. I've gave the best years of my life to it. She spoke the words defiantly. You said that all afore, Ma. It's true, she murmured. Terrible true. And I done it for you. Benny, I wanted to be giving you something. It's all I'd got to give you, Benny. There's many a man been that's glad of his farm. And grateful, too. There's many that makes it pay. And what'll I do if it does pay, Ma? What'll I do then? I don't know, Benny. It's only just beginning now. But if it does pay, Ma, what'll I do? Go away from here? Nah, Benny. Not away. What did you go away for when it pays? After all them years I gave to it. His spoon clattered noisily to his plate. He pushed his chair back from the table. The legs of it rasped loudly along the uncarpeted floor. He got to his feet. Let's go on outside, he said. There ain't no sense to this here talking and talking. She glanced up at him. Her eyes were narrow and hard. All right, Benny. I'll clear up. I'll be along in a minute. All right, Benny. He slouched heavily out of the room. She sat where she was, the set look pressed on her face. Automatically, her hands reached out among the dishes, pulling them toward her. Outside, the boy sank down on the step. It was getting dark. There were shadows along the ground, blue shadows. In the graying skies, one star shone brilliantly. Beyond the mist-slurred summit of a hill, the full moon grew yellow. In front of him was the slope of wind-moved cornfield, and in the center of it the dim, military figure standing waist-deep in the corn. His eyes fixed themselves to it. Old uniform, with a stick, into it. He whispered the words very low. Still, standing there, still. The same wooden attitude of it. His same, cunning watching of it. There was a wind. He knew it was going over his face. He could feel the cool of the wind across his moistened lips. He took a deep breath. Down there in the shivering cornfield, standing in the dark, blue shadows, the dim figure had quivered. An arm moved, swaying to and fro. The other arm began, swaying, swaying. A tremor ran through it. Once it pivoted, the head shook slowly from side to side. The arms rose and fell, and rose again. The head came up and down and rocked a bit to either side. I'm here, he muttered involuntarily. Here. The arms were tossing and stretching. He thought the head faced in his direction. The wind had died out. The arms went down and came up and reached. Benny. The woman seated herself on the step at his side. Look, he mumbled. Look. He pointed his hand at the dim figure shifting restlessly in the quiet, shadow-saturated cornfield. Her eyes followed after his. "Oh, Benny." "Well," his voice was hoarse. "It's moving, ain't it? You can see it moving for yourself, can't you? You ain't able to say you don't see it, are you?" "The wind," she stammered. "Where's the wind?" "Down there." "D'you feel a wind? Say, d'you feel a wind?" "Meb, down there. There ain't no wind. Not now, there ain't. And it's moving, ain't it? Say, it's moving, ain't it? It looks like it was dancing. So it does. Like as if it was making itself dance." His eyes were still riveted on those arms that came up and down, and reached. "It'll stop soon now." He stuttered it more to himself than to her. "Then, it'll be still. I've watched it mighty often. Meb, it knows I watch it. Meb, that's why it moves." "Ah, Benny. Well, you see it, don't you? You thought there was something the matter with me when I come and told you how it waves and waves. But you seen it waving, ain't you?" "It's nothing, Ben. Look, Benny. It stopped." The two of them stared down the slope at the dim, military figure standing rigid and waist-deep in the cornfield. The woman gave a quick sigh of relief. For several moments they were silent. From somewhere in the distance came the harsh, discordant sound of bullfrogs croaking. Out in the night, a dog bayed at the golden, full moon climbing up over the hills. A bird circled between sky and earth, hovering above the cornfield. They saw its slow descent, and then for a second they caught the startled whir of its wings as it flew blindly into the night. "That old scarecrow," she muttered. "S'pose," he whispered. "S'pose when it starts it's moving like that. I s'pose some day it walks out of that there cornfield. Just naturally walks out here to me. What then, if it walks out?" "Benny, that's what I'm thinking of all the time. If it takes it into its head to just naturally walk out here, what's going to stop it if it wants to walk out after me? Once it starts moving that way, what?" "Benny, it couldn't do that. It couldn't." "Meb, it won't. Meb, it'll just beckon first. Meb, it won't come after me. Not if I go when it beckons. I kind of figure it'll beckon when it wants me. I couldn't stand the other. I couldn't wait for it to come out here after me. I kind of feel it'll beckon. When it beckons, I'll be going. Benny, there's sickness coming on you." "'Tain't no sickness." The woman's hands were clenched together in her lap. "I wish to God," she said, "I wish I ain't never seen the day when I put that there thing up in that there cornfield. But I ain't thought nothing like this could never happen. I wish to God I ain't never seen the day. 'Tain't got nothing to do with you." His voice was very low. "It's got everything to do with me. So it has. You said that afore yourself, and you was right. Ain't I put it up? Ain't I looked high and low the house through? Ain't that old uniform of your granddad's been the only rag I could lay my hands on? Was there anything else I could use? Was there? Ah, Ma, ain't we needed a scarecrow down there? With them birds so awful bad? Pecking away at the corn, and pecking. 'Tain't your fault, Ma. There warn't nothing else but that their old uniform. I wouldn't have took it otherwise. Poor old Pa, so desperate proud of it as he was. Him fighting for his country in it. Always saying that he was. He couldn't be doing enough for his country, and that their old uniform meaning so much to him. Like a part of him I used to think it. And, you wanting to say something, Ben? Nah. He wouldn't even let us be burying him in it. Put my country's flag next my skin, he told us. When I die, keep the old uniform. Just like a part of him, he thought it. Wouldn't I have kept it, falling to pieces as it is, if there'd have been anything else to put up there in that there cornfield? She felt the boy stiffen suddenly, and with him a soldier. He broke off abruptly. She sensed what he was about to say. "Ah, Benny, that was different. Honest, it was. He weren't the only one in his family. There was 2 brothers." The boy got to his feet. "Why won't you let me go?" He asked it passionately. "Why'd you keep me here? You know I ain't happy. You know all the men VE gone from these here parts. You know I ain't happy. Ain't you going to see how much I want to go? Ain't you able to know that I want to fight for my country? The way he did his fighting. The boy jerked his head in the direction of the figure, standing waist deep in the cornfield, standing rigidly and faintly outlined beneath the haunting flood of moonlight. Nah, Benny, you can't go. Nah. Why, Ma? Why'd you keep saying that and saying it? I'm all alone, Benny. I've gave all my best years to make the farm pay for you. You gotta stay, Benny. You gotta stay on here with me. You just plain got to. You'll be glad someday, Benny. Later on. You'll be right glad. She saw him thrust his hands hastily into his trouser pockets. Glad? His voice sounded tired. I'll be shamed. That's what I'll be. Nothing, Jew here. Nothing, but shamed. She started to her feet. Benny, a note of fear shook through the words. You wouldn't go? He waited a moment before he answered her. If you ain't wanting me to go, I'll stay. God, I guess I plain got to stay. That's a good boy, Benny. You won't never be sorry, nohow. I promise you. I'll be making it up to you. Honest, I will. There's lots of ways I'll. He interrupted her. Only, Ma, I won't let it come after me. If it beckons, I got to go. She gave a sudden laugh that trailed off uncertainly. Tain't going to beckon, Benny. It if beckons, Ma. Tain't going to, Benny. Tain't nothing but the wind that moves it. It's just the wind, sure. Meb you got a touch of fever. Meb you better go on to bed. You'll be all right in the morning. Just you wait and see. You're a good boy, Benny. You'll never go off and leave your ma and the farm. You're a fine lad, Benny. If it beckons, he repeated in weary monotone. Tain't, Benny. I'll be going to bed, he said. That's it, Benny. Good night. Good night, Ma. She stood there listening to his feet thudding up the stairs. She heard him knocking about in the room overhead. A door banged. She stood quite still. There were footsteps moving slowly. A window was thrown open. She looked up to see him leaning far out over the sill. Her eyes went down the slope of the moonlight-bathed cornfield. Her right hand curled itself into a fist. "Oh, Scarecrow." She half laughed. She waited there until she saw the boy draw away from the window. She went into the house and bolted the door behind her. Then she went up the narrow steps. That night she lay awake for a long time. The heat had grown intense. She found herself tossing from side to side of the small bed. The window shade had stuck at the top of the window. The moonlight trickled into the room. She could see the window-framed, star-specked patch of the skies. When she sat up, she saw the round, reddish-yellow ball of the moon. She must have dozed, because she woke with a start. She felt that she had had a fearful, evil dream. The horror of it clung to her. The room was like an oven. She thought the walls were coming together and the ceiling pressing down. Her body was covered with sweat. She forced herself wide awake. She made herself get out of the bed. She stood for a second uncertain. Then she went to the window. Not a breath of air stirring. The moon was high in the sky. She looked out across the hills. Down there to the left, the acres of potatoes. Potatoes were paying. She counted on a big harvest. To the right, the wheat. Only the second year for those 5 fields. She knew that she had done well with them. She thought, with a smile running over her lips, back to the time when less than half of the place had been under cultivation. She remembered her dream of getting the whole of her farm in work. She and the boy had made good. She thought of that with savage complacency. It had been a struggle, a bitter, hard fight from the beginning, but she had made good with her farm. And there down the slope, just in front of the house, the cornfield. And in the center of it, standing waist deep in the corn, the antiquated, military figure. The smile slid from her mouth. The suffocating heat was terrific. Not a breath of air. Suddenly, she began to shake from head to foot. Her eyes, wide and staring, were fixed on the moonlight-whitened cornfield. Her eyes were held to the moonlight-streaked figure standing in the ghostly corn. Moving. An arm swayed to and fro, backwards and forwards, backwards, the other arm, swaying, a tremor ran through it. Once it pivoted, the head shook slowly from side to side. The arms rose and fell, and rose again. The head came up and down, and rocked a bit to either side. "Dancing," she whispered stupidly. "Dancing." She thought she could not breathe. She had never felt such oppressive heat. The arms were tossing and stretching. She could not take her eyes from it. And then she saw both arms reach out, and slowly, very slowly, she saw the hands of them, beckoning. In the stillness of the room next to her, she thought she heard a crash. She listened intently, her eyes stuck to those reaching arms, and the hands of them that beckoned and beckoned. "Benny," she murmured, "Benny." Silence. She could not think. It was his talk that had done this, Benny's talk. He had said something about it, walking out, if it should come out, moving all over like that. If its feet should start, if they should of a sudden begin to shuffle out of the cornfield. But Benny wasn't awake. He couldn't see it. Thank God. If only something would hold. If only it would stop. God. Nothing stirring out there in the haunting moonlighted night. Nothing moving. Nothing but the figure standing waist deep in the cornfield. And even as she looked, the rigid, military figure grew still. Still, now, but for those slow, beckoning hands. A tremendous dizziness came over her. She closed her eyes for a second, and then she stumbled back to the bed. She lay there panting. She pulled the sheets up across her face, her shaking fingers working the tops of them into a hard ball. She stuffed it between her chattering teeth. Whatever happened, Benny mustn't hear her. She mustn't waken. Benny. Thank heaven. Benny was asleep. Benny must never know how. Out there in the whitened night, the hands of the figure slowly and unceasingly beckoned and beckoned. The sight of those reaching arms stayed before her. When, hours later, she fell asleep, she still saw the slow-moving, motioning hands. It was morning when she wakened. The sun streamed into the room. She went to the door and opened it. "Benny," she called. "Oh, Benny." There was no answer. "Benny," she called again. "Get on up. It's late, Benny." The house was quiet. She half-dressed herself and went into his room. The bed had been slept in. She saw that at a glance. His clothes were not there. Down in the field, because she'd forgotten to wake him. In a sudden stunning flash, she remembered the crash she had heard. It took her a long while to get to the little closet behind the bed. Before she opened it, she knew it would be empty. The door creaked open. His one hat and coat were gone. She had known that. He had seen those two reaching arms. He had seen those two hands that had slowly, very slowly, beckoned. She went to the window, her eyes staring straight before her, down the slope in front of the house, caught sight of something blue and antiquatedly military standing waist deep and rigid in the cornfield. "You old scarecrow," she whimpered. "Why were you standing there?" She sobbed. "What are you standing still for now?" Next story. Mutter Schwegel. He was tremendously disappointed. The house was empty. He had thought it looked uninhabited from the outside. It made him a bit dreary to have his people away like this. That uncertain feeling came over him again. The uncertain feeling never quite left him of late. He was conscious of it most of the time. It formed an intangible background to all his other thought. He decided he would go down to the lodge presently. He was certain to find Bennett at the lodge, and Bennett's wife, and Bennett's 3 children. He grinned as he thought of Bennett chasing his children out of his gardens. He could imagine the old gardener's gladness at his homecoming. Going quickly up the last flight of stairs, he could see that the door of his room stood ajar. He wondered at the yellow glow of light trickling in a long, narrow stream out into the dark of the hall. He went rushing along the corridor. He pushed the door open. The same old room. The familiar, faded wallpaper. The high, mahogany bed. The hunting print he had so cherished on the wall facing him. The table just as he had left it. The books piled in neat stacks on its polished surface. the lamp standing lighted among the books, the two big armchairs. He took a deep breath of surprise. Someone was seated in the chair facing from him. He saw the top of a man's head. He had a dim recognition of feet sprawling from under the chair. On either arm of the chair rested a man's hand. There was something he knew about those hands. The prominent knuckles, the long, well-made fingers. The heavy, silver signet ring on the smallest finger of the left hand was a ring he had often seen. He crossed the room. Otto. Standing there in front of Kurz, he wondered at the change in him. He looked so much older. There was no trace left of the boyishness which he had always associated with Otto Kurz. There were gray streaks in Kurz's heavy hair, gray at the temples of the wide forehead, gray behind the ears. The mustache and beard were threaded with grayed hairs. He was astonished to find Otto Kurz in his room. Otto, I had no idea that you would be here. He could not understand the rigid attitude of the man's great body, the set mobility of the man's large-hewn features. He moved a bit so as to stand directly in the line of those fixed, staring eyes. He wanted to interrupt the wooden expression of those eyes. Otto, it was good of you to come. Kurz's eyes raised themselves to meet his eyes. He quivered at the look in Kurz's eyes. My God, what is it? The glazed, deadened eyes with the live, dumb suffering behind them widened. Charlie. What's happened, Otto? I do not know. I was waiting, Charlie, for you to come. Good old Otto. He saw Kurz's hand with the heavy, silver signet ring on the smallest finger go up trembling to his beard. It was the old familiar gesture. Good. Did you say good of me, Charlie? Yes, yes. He insisted eagerly. Of course it was good of you to come and meet me. I had to come. For he is second, he wondered. But how did you know? Who told you? I only just got here. No one knew. How could you have known I was coming? He heard Kurz sigh, a long sigh that quavered at the end. How I hoped that I would come? That you would come, Charlie. He could not fathom the look in Kurz's eyes. He had never seen a look like that in those eyes. He thought that it was not a human look. See here, Otto. What is it? Kurz made a little, appealing gesture with his long, trembling hands. Later, I will try to tell you. Later? Kurz nodded his great, shaggy head up and down. How did you come in here, Charlie? He was surprised at the question. How? Why, with my latchkey, of course. He glanced over at the windows. The blinds were up. He could see the dark pressing against the glass, pressing tightly so that it spread. He started for the window. Kurz's voice stopped him. And your family? You have then seen your family, Charlie? He smiled. No, not yet. They weren't here when you came in, were they? No. I have seen no one. I could not bring myself to go before anyone. There was an old man. He was going down the hall. I waited till he passed. He must have come to light your lamp. Well, old Otto, they're not here. I've hunted all through the house for them. I rather think they must have gone down to Surrey. They've taken the servants with them. After a bit, we'll walk over to the lodge and ask Bennett where my people are. That must have been Bennett you saw up here. Then you do not know? Know what? About your family? But I just told you, Otto. They must have run down to our place in Surrey. I only came up here to get a look at the old room. I'll go down and ask Bennett presently. A quick moan escaped through Kurz's set lips. A sudden thought flashed to him. You, Otto, how did you get in here? With them all away? With the servants gone? He saw the muscles of Kurz's face twitch horribly. You must not ask, Charlie. A little time, Charlie. There are things I do not myself know. Later, I will try to tell you. Things you do not know, Otto? Kurz's mouth twisted itself into a distorted grin. I do not blame you for ridiculing me, Charlie. I always thought I knew everything. Later, you will see. Why not tell me now? No. Kurz's voice whined frantically. I do not know if you yourself understand. I was only trying to help you, old chap. Help. It is that I want. It is that which brought me here. It is because I must have you help me. You've only to say what you want. Your help. You know I'll do whatever I can for you. Yes, I hope that. I counted on your help. He waited for Kurz to go on. Kurz sat there silent. The long, shaking fingers fumbled at each other. Well, later. All right, I don't know what you're driving at. Are you sure you do not know? But if you don't want to tell me now, why, tell me in your own good time, old fellow. Yes, you are not angry? You do not care if I say it later? Of course I don't care. Not care, if you knew. If it is true, you will care. He could not make out what Kurz meant. It's mighty nice seeing you, he said after a second's silence. It's been a long time. Years since I've seen you. I came though, Charlie. I had to come, Charlie. I'm jolly well glad you did. You knew I would come. He drew his brows together in a perplexed frown. I knew we would meet sometime. Yes, sometime. And the sometimes now. Otto. Now. Kurz's big body strained forward. What is it, Charlie? This now? The frown stayed over his eyes. We were bound to come together again, old Otto. You and I were pretty good pals back there at your university. What a time we two had together. And old Mutter Schwegel. How old Mutter Schwegel fussed over us. How she took care of us. It all seems like yesterday. Kurz got out of his chair. Old Mutter Schwegel, he muttered. Dear old Mutter Schwegel. Kurz's eyes stole away from his face. Later, I shall tell you of Mutter Schwegel too. And the talks we used to have. The night-long talks. We settled the affairs of the world nicely in those days. Didn't we, old Otto? The affairs of the world. And old Mutter Schwegel coming in to put out the light. And then standing there to hear what we had to say of life and of death. Of life and of death. And not being able to tear herself away to go to bed. She thought we were wise, Otto. She used to drink in every word we said. And then she'd scold us for staying up all night. Old Mutter Schwegel. I've thought of her often. Kurz made a movement toward him. And of me, Charlie. You had thought of me? I say, rather. Many a time. When they called me back from the university, even after I went out to France, I thought of you. His mind was muddled a bit. He put it down to the excitement of his coming home. That uncertain feeling came over him again quite strongly. But he had thought of Otto. He remembered he had thought of Otto a lot. And what was it you thought of me, Charlie? It came back to him that there had been one time when he had thought of Otto particularly. That one time when something tremendous had happened to him. He could not quite think what. He knew he had been glad when he thought of Otto because he had been spared inflicting the thing on him. He could not get it clear. He avoided looking at Kurz. Why, I wondered what you were doing. All that sort of thing. You know what I mean. Yes, I know. I did go into the army, Charlie. It was that sort of thing you meant, Charlie? He felt himself start. I was afraid you would do that, he said involuntarily. Yes, I too was afraid. Kurz's voice was low. You? Afraid? Charlie. You know it? The fear it was not for myself. He walked over to the window. He stood there looking down at the huge boxwood hedges looming in thick gray bulks up from the smudging reach of the heavily matted shadows. He turned. You funked meeting me in war? God forbid that I should meet you in war. I too, he said it quickly, I too was afraid that I should come upon you. It haunted me. That fear I might harm you. It stayed with me, day and night. I shouldn't want to hurt you, Otto. I prayed. It came back to him how often he had prayed it. I always prayed that it might never be you. Yes, I know. He went and stood close beside Kurz. He found himself staring at Kurz intently. But you're here, in England. I say, did they make you a prisoner? Could my people get parole for you? No, I do not think they do that here in your country. I do not need parole, Charlie. I thought perhaps. No. But how did you get here then? Charlie, Charlie. Eh? Will you not then wait? Come, old Otto. You've got something to tell me. If you don't want to say how you got here, why, all right. Only, you'd best get it off your mind. Whatever it is, you'd better come out and say what you came to say. Kurz slid back into the chair again. The room was still, heavy with silence. Yes, I'll tell you if I can. Charlie, it is hard to say. He tried to help Kurz. It's about this war of ours. That's it, isn't it? About the war? Yes. Then tell me. He saw Kurz's massive shoulders jerking. How can I tell you? I do not think you understand. I do not even know if it is what I think it is. I cannot reason it out to myself. The power of reasoning has left me. I had no other knowledge than my reasoning. I do not know. Now, I do not know where I am, or what I am. The maddened urge of Kurz's words struck him. You're here, old Otto, he said it reassuringly. Here with me, in my room, in England. You're with me, Otto. Yes, with you. And then beneath his breath he whispered, Where are you? He caught the smothered insistence of that last sentence. He smiled, forcing his lips to smile. Standing right in front of you, old man, waiting for you to say what you came to. Kurz interrupted him. I had to come. I felt that I must come. I came, Charlie. I got myself here, Charlie. Quite right, Otto. I want you to know first that I thought of you. That I was, as you say you were, afraid I might in some way injure you. I want to tell you that first. Good old sentimental Otto. Sentimental? ACH. I am not sentimental. But I do not think you can understand how much you were to me back there at the university. I do not think you yourself knew how much you joyed in things. How happy your kind of thought made you. He laughed. I always managed to have a rather corking time of it, he admitted. You loved everything so, Kurz went on. At night when we talked, it was you who believed in what you said. It was you who saw so clearly how well all things of life were meant. It was always I who questioned. But, I say, old Otto, your mind was so quick, so brilliant. You could pick flaws where I never knew they existed. It was you who had so much of faith, Charlie. How we did talk, he said it to himself. Talk and talk until old Mutter Schwegel, who was so keen for us, grew tired of listening and came and turned out the lamp. And how you spoke ever of your beliefs. Kurz's voice was hoarse. It was so easy for you to know. You never questioned. You believed. It ended there, with your belief. You were so near to what you thought. It was a part of you. I stood away from all things and from myself. I would tell you that the mind should reason. I stayed outside with my criticism, while you... Charlie, how you did know. And how you laughed at me for that. But now, I do not laugh. Kurz protested with wearied eagerness. Now I come to you. I ask you if you know those things now? What things, Otto? The things of life. The things of death. I know what I always knew, he said slowly. I know that life is meant to live fully and understandingly, and that death is meant to live on, fully and understandingly. And you do understand now? I understand that always. You would not be afraid? Of what? Of death? No. He stared out of the window, the dense, opaque shadows pressing down on the garden, the shadows hanging loose and thick on the high, boxwood hedges, the dark, smooth, night sky. And suddenly a faint tremor ran through him from head to foot. He pressed his face close to the glass. His hands went up, screening a small space for his eyes. In the still block of shadows, in the black mass of them, he had seen something. Something had moved against the quiet, clumping shadows. I say, he whispered, there's someone coming up through the garden. Yes, yes. They were silent for a long time. Once he looked at Kurz huddled in the armchair, his face white and drawn. his eyes staring before him. He thought he heard footsteps coming softly up the stairs, footsteps that came lightly and hesitated and then came on again. "Charlie," Kurz stammered. "Charlie." He felt that someone was standing in the open doorway. He turned. His eyes took in the well-known figure, the sweet face with its red cheeks and its framing white hair, the short body, the blue eyes that were fixed on him. "Mutter Schwegel," he shouted. Kurz leaped to his feet. "What?" He started for the door. "Mutter Schwegel, who would have thought of your coming here? It has been a long time. I say, but I am glad." "Stop!" Kurz's voice thundered behind him. He wheeled to look at Kurz. Kurz's eyes were riveted on the woman standing in the doorway. "Aren't you glad to see Mutter Schwegel?" he asked. "When we've been talking of her all night?" Kurz was muttering to himself. "Mutter Schwegel," Kurz mumbled. "Mutter Schwegel. It is that I wanted to tell you about Mutter Schwegel. It is as I thought. It is ACH. It is then that way with us." He felt that the woman was coming into the room. He turned and looked at her. "Mutter Schwegel is dead," Kurz stammered. He saw that the old woman smiled. "She is dead." "Dead," Kurz mumbled. He smiled back at her. "Dead." Kurz's voice droned, shaking. He saw the old woman go to the table. He and Kurz watched her take the lamp up in her hands. He and Kurz saw her fingers fumbling at the wick. Kurz's quivering face stood out in the lamplight. The old woman was smiling quietly. They saw her try to put out the light. The lamp still burned. "Mutter Schwegel is dead." Kurz's voice quavered, and then it screamed. "Dead," he shrieked. "We are, all of us, dead." That uncertain feeling came over him, and suddenly it went quite from him. Next story, Haunted. He lived quite alone in the stone-built shanty, perched on the highest pinnacle of the great sun-bleached chalk cliffs. All about him, as far as the eye could reach, lay the flat, salt marshes with their dank, yellowed grasses. Against the inland horizon, three gaunt, thin-foliaged trees reared themselves from the monotonously even soil. Overhead the clouds splotched blue-gray sky, and below him the changing, motion-pulled, current-swirling depths of the blue-green sea. And at all times of the day and the night, the wild whirring of the seagulls' wings and the uncanny and human-piercing sound of their shrieking. He had lived there since that day when the fishermen had pulled him half-drowned out of the sea. He could never remember where he had come from or what had happened. All that he ever knew was that far out by the nets in the early morning they had come upon him and had brought him in to shore. Naturally, the fishermen had questioned him, but his vagueness, his absolute lack of belief that he had ever been anything before they had snatched him from the waters, had frightened them so that since that day they had left him severely alone. Fishing folk have strange, superstitious ideas about certain things. He had borne the full weight of their credulous awe, perhaps because he, himself, thought as they thought, that he was something come from the sea, and of the sea, and always belonging to the sea. He had built himself the stone shanty upon the highest pinnacle of those waste-grown chalk cliffs, and he had stayed on, year in and year out, close there to the sea. In winter, for a livelihood, he made baskets from the reeds he had picked in the swamps about him. In the summer, he sold the vegetables he grew in the tiny truck garden behind his house. Somehow he managed to eke out a living. The fishing folk in the small village at the foot of the cliffs saw him come and go along their narrow streets, morose and taciturn. He never spoke to any of them unless he had to. They in their turn avoided him with their habitual superstitious uneasiness. He went to and fro between his shanty and the village store when the need arose. The rest of the time he sat in front of his iron-bolted door staring down at the sea. Daybreak and noon, evening and night he sat there. When the sky above was tinged with the first streaking colors of the dawn, he watched the ghostly gray expanse of the ocean. When the sun was high in the heavens, he looked steadily at the light-flecked, spotted swells of the waves. When the shadows began to creep up from the earth, he stared at the greater blackness that swam in glistening, undulating darkness to him from across the water. And at night his eyes strained through the fitful gloom at the pitchy, turbulent sea. It was like that in all kinds of weather. The spring tides, with their quick changes from calm to storm, and the slender silver crescent of the new moon hanging just above the horizon. The long summer laziness of the green ocean with its later gigantic flame-red moons, and the wide yellow streak of phosphorescent light that streamed in moving ripples to him. The chill, lashing spray in autumn. The foam-covered, seething breadth of it in winter when the blackness of the low night skies and the darkness of the high tides were as one menacing, roaring turmoil churning itself into white, spumed frenzy. It always held him. He was a man of one idea, the sea. He was a man who drew his life from one source, the sea. It had taken his body and had tried to drown it. The sea had, for that short time, caught and gripped his soul. The slimy, wet touch of it was seared into him. It fascinated him. It kept him near it so that he could not have gotten away from it had he had the courage to want to get away. It kept him there as though he belonged to it, as though it knew he belonged to it, and knew that he knew it. And always and ever the sea haunted him. The fishing men coming home late at night across the water had grown used to steering their course by the unreal light that trickled out to them from the shanty on the top of the cliffs. And in the dawn when they pushed their smacks off from the long, hard beach to sail out to the nets, they knew that from the high precipices above them the man was watching, and outwardly they laughed at him, even when in their hearts they feared the thing they thought he was. They could not understand him. They, who made their living from the sea, could not understand how he could be content to live the way he was living. They could not have known that he would infinitely rather have died than to have taken one thing from out the sea from which he had already filched his soul. His enslavement by it had made him understand it a lot better than they understood it. And so he lived the stupid, hypnotized life of one who was held so enchained and cowed that he could not think for himself or of himself. Until that day when he first met Sally. It was a sunny day late in the autumn that he stood in front of the weather-beaten wooden hut of the village store, his arms filled with baskets. And as he stood there, Sally Walsh came from the store and out into the street. She had seen the man 100 times, but she had never seen him so close. She stopped short and stared quite frankly at the bigness of him, at the heavily matted hair clinging so damply to his forehead, and at the white face so strange to her beside the sunburned faces she had always seen. It was when, quite suddenly, he looked at her and she saw the odd blue-green sea-colored eyes of him, that she started to hurry on. She had gotten halfway down the street when he overtook her. "Do you want anything of me?" He asked it, his blue-green eyes going quickly over her slight form, her small face, and resting for a second curiously upon her masses of coiled golden hair. "I? Why, no." "You sure?" "Sure." She went on her way again, and he stood there watching her go. Then he turned abruptly and walked slowly back to the store. It was not so long after that when he met her for the second time. She was on her knees in the yard in front of her father's house, mending the tar-covered fishing nets with quick, deft fingers. He stopped at the gate. Feeling the intensity of his blue-green eyes upon her, she looked up and saw him. She got to her feet. "It's a nice morning." She spoke to him first. "Yes," he said. "You live up there?" She pointed a bare brown arm up toward the sun-bleached chalk cliffs. "By yourself?" "Yes." "You ain't got a boat?" "No." "They say you don't ever fish. Why don't you, mister?" I ain't the one to fish. Want to help me with these here nets?" I can't do that. It ain't hard, mister. I can't do it." "Come on in. I'll show you how." He opened the gate and went into the yard, and then he stood there just looking down at her. "I wouldn't touch no net." Her brows drew together in a puzzled frown. "You mean you don't like fishing?" Somehow he did not want her to know. "I ain't the one to take no sea thing away from the sea." "Oh," she said, not understanding. They were silent a moment. "You sell baskets?" she asked him. Jew want one. Meb, got a medium-sized one. Got a lot. Meb, I could use one. I'd like mighty well to give you one, little girl. Why, I ain't a little girl, mister. I thought I'd Meb buy. He interrupted her. You'll not buy one off of me. I'll bring you one, if you like. A medium-sized one. I'll bring it to you, tomorrow. Thanks. Goodbye, little girl. Goodbye, mister. At the end of the street, he turned to look back. She was on her knees working at her mending of the nets again. She looked very small kneeling there on the hard brown earth with the straggling lines of squat weather-darkened shanties trailing behind her out onto the edge of the yellow sanded beach and the clear unbroken blue of the autumn skies above. She glanced up and then she waved her hand at him. He went slowly along the narrow pathway that wound through the sharp crevices of the chalk cliffs to the back of his own stone-built shanty. That night he stood staring out at the sea. The moon was on the wane. It hung very low in the sky, so that the red-gold streak of it seemed to dip into the water. A cold northeast wind lashed over the waves. Dark, swollen, purplish clouds raced together in an angry mass. The sea itself was black, but for the tossing gigantic waves with their dead white crests of spraying foam. The pounding of them on the beach below him vibrated in his ears. The seagulls were flying heavily close to the earth, their inhuman, piercing shrieking filling the air. The little girl had spoken to him. He turned from the sea then. He went into his shanty. He bolted the great iron bolts of the door and braced himself against it as if he were shutting something out, something that he feared, something that was certain to come after him. He crouched there shivering and shuddering. The pounding of the sea was in his ears. The wind that came from the ocean whistled and wailed shrilly around and around the house. He leaned there, his back to the door, his hands pressing stiff-fingered against it, his lips moving, mumbling dumbly. His eyes, the color of the sea, stared blindly before him. The rumbling roar of the rising tide, the thundering boom of it, and in the sudden lull of the wind the hiss of the seething spray. The sea was angry. He thought with a kind of paralyzing terror that it was angry with him. It was calling to him. The lashing of the big waves demanded him, the sonorous drumming of it. He had never before denied its call. The persistent thudding of it there at the base of the chalk cliffs. It was insisting that he belonged to it. The inhuman piercing shrieks of the circling seagulls mocked him. They knew that he belonged to the sea. How could he even think of that golden-haired little girl who had spoken to him? The sea was angry. He tore at the iron bolts and flinging the door wide open, he rushed out to the edge of the chalk cliffs. And as he stood there, the clouds dwindled in a vaporous haze away from the skies. The thin red-gold line of the waning moon grew brighter. The sea lay foam-flecked and calm beneath the dark heavens. And at the base of the chalk cliffs the water lapped and lapped with a strange, insidious sound. And the next day he sat there in front of his shanty, his reeds in his hands, his fingers busy with his basket weaving, making big baskets and small baskets, and his eyes, blue-green and strained, were fixed on the tranquil blue-green of the water below him. For 2 days he sat there in front of his iron-bolted door that now swung wide open on its rusty hinges. The third day he stood upon the edge of the precipice. It was a gray fog-drenched day. The mist dripped all about him. The opaque veil of it shut out everything in wet obliteration. He stood quite still, knowing that beneath its dank, dribbling thickness, the sea churned wildly in its rising tide. And standing there motionless, he heard a voice calling through the quiet denseness of the fog, a voice coming from a distance and muffled by the mist. He started. It was her voice calling to him from the narrow pathway that wound up the chalk cliffs to the back of his shanty. "Mr. Oh, mister." He reached his hand out in front of him, trying to break the saturating cover of the fog. He went stumbling unseeingly toward the rear of the house. "Mr. Oh, mister." The rear of the shanty. His feet sank down into the turned soil of the truck garden. He stood still. "Here, mister." The voice of her was nearer. "Where are you?" He could not see in front of him. He felt that she was close. "Here, little girl." He saw the faint outline of her shadow, then through the obliterating denseness of the mist. Some fog, ain't it, mister? Stay where you are. There's the precipice. I ain't afraid of no precipice. Stay where you are. He could hear the dripping of the mist over the window ledges, and then he thought he heard, smothered by the weight of the fog, the pounding of the sea. You surprised to see me? But you ain't able to see me, are you? No, you ain't surprised? Down there at the base of the chalk cliffs the sea was still, waiting. You shouldn't have come. Why, you don't mean? You ain't trying to tell me. You don't want me here? Great beads of moisture trickled down across his eyes. Little girl, I just said you shouldn't have come. Not up here in this kind of weather. Oh, the weather. She laughed. I ain't the one to mind the weather, mister. Again he reached his hand out in front of him in an effort to rend the suffocating thickness of the fog. His fingers touched her arm and closed over it. From below him came the repeated warning roar of the waves. Can you find your way home? By yourself, little girl? I ain't going home, mister. Not yet. I came up here to get that basket you said you had for me. You know, the medium-sized one. I'll give it to you now. Her hand caught at his hand that lay on her arm. Her fingers fastened themselves around his and held tightly. He had never felt anything like that. The touch of them was cool and fresh, like seaweed that had just drifted in from the sea. And then from far off across the water came the shrill, piercing shriek of a gull. He felt her start. That's only a seagull, little girl. I know, mister, but don't it sound strange? Almost as if it were the sea itself, calling for something. For a second he could not speak. Why? His voice was hoarse. Why'd you say that? I don't know. Sometimes I get to feeling mighty queer about that water out there. You mean, why? You ain't afraid of it, little girl, are you? Afraid? There ain't nothing that I'm afraid of, mister. Why? I'd go anywhere and not be afraid. He repeated her words very slowly to himself. You'd go anywhere and not be afraid. He thought then that the fog was lifting. A sickly, yellowish glow filtered through the heavy grayness. He could see her more distinctly. There's only one thing about the sea, mister, that'd scare me, and that's... She broke off abruptly. What, little girl? Why, mister, why? I can't hardly say it. But there's Pa and there's my brother, Will. If anything ever happened, if the sea ever did anything to Pa or Will, why, I guess, mister, I'd just die. Don't, he said quickly. Don't you talk like that. For a second they were silent. The sun was breaking through the dwindling thickness of the mist. He could see it lifting in a faint gray line, uncovering the reach of the flat salt marshes with their dank yellowed grasses. A thin silver net of it hung for a second between the sky and the earth and was gone. From the base of the chalk cliffs came the sound of the sea lapping and lapping with insistent cunning. She dropped his hand and she stood there looking up to him, scanning his white face with those childlike eyes of hers. You live up here because of the sea, mister? Yes. You ever feel the sea something, alive, like you and me? You feel that too? Yes, she said slowly, and I knew you felt it, because the first time I saw you, why? You're somehow, something like the sea. His hands clenched at his sides. His breath came in quick, rasping gasps. I'll get your basket, he muttered. He rushed into his one-room shanty and caught up the basket nearest to him and went out again to her. She took the basket from him in silence. She slipped the handle of it onto her arm. Her hands rubbed against each other, the fingers of them twining and intertwining. I'll be going now, mister. Yes. I've got to be getting home before Pa, and we'll go out to the nets. Goodbye, little girl. Goodbye, mister, and thanks. He stood there and watched her go from the back of his stone-built shanty down the narrow, winding path that lay along the sun-bleached chalk cliffs. She went quickly and lightly down the steep incline, her small, slender figure in its blue print dress, with the sun bringing out the burnished glints in her golden hair. his eyes strained after her. In a short while he lost her from sight. He went back to his basket-making then, and as he sat there, his fingers weaving and bending the supple reeds, mechanically working them into shape, he tried to shut out all thought of her, to feel as though she had never come to him, to rivet his attention upon the insistent pounding of the sea that hurled itself again and again at the base of the chalk cliffs, calling and calling to him. After a while, the early deep blue dusk of the twilight came. He got stiffly to his feet. The long moving shadows were quivering in fantastic purpled patterns on the ground about him. Great daubs of them clung in the crevices of the chalk cliffs. A mat of shadows crept over the flat salt marshes and through the dank yellowed grasses. There was a sudden chill in the wind that came to him from off the water. A flock of screeching seagulls, wildly beating their wings, rose from the cliffs and whirred out toward the open sea, the uncanny piercing sound of their shrieking coming deafeningly back to him. He stood there staring at the ocean, his head well back, his nostrils dilated, his blue-green eyes strangely wide. Far in the distance against the graying horizon, he could see the choppy white-capped waves racing over the smooth, dark water. Even as he looked, the sea began to rise in great swollen billows. The wind, too, was rising. He could hear the distant cry of it. His heart began to thump wildly. He knew what was going to happen, just as he always knew. He could feel what the sea was going to do. He stood there undecided. A quick picture came to him of the storm. He had seen it all before. He had stood there on the chalk cliffs and watched it all. Watched the shattered, broken logs, the swirling, sucking water. The sea had held him under its spell, had compelled him to witness its maddened, infuriated stalking of its prey. Her people were out there, her Pa and her Will. Why had she told him that? Why had she said if anything ever happened to them she would die? Why? He could just make out the stiff sticks of the nets reaching thin and dark from the surface of the gray water against the lighter gray skies, and the boats rowing toward them. The boats with the fishermen. He could see the slender patches of them rising and falling with the waves, going slowly to the nets. He could distinguish the small, dark shadows of the men rowing. They had pulled him out of the sea in that early morning. He who was something come from the sea and of the sea, and always belonging to the sea, to betray the sea. The waves were racing in to the shore. The thumping, deafening boom of them there at the base of the chalk cliffs below him. He tried to tear his eyes away from it. It held him as it ever held him. It kept him there as though he belonged to it, as though it knew he belonged to it, and knew that he knew it. A strange uneasiness arose within him. Even before he was conscious of it, he felt that the sea had sensed it. Its insistent, angry pounding threatened him. She had said that she would die. Below him the swirling, churning sea. He turned then and went very slowly down the narrow, winding path that led along the sun-bleached chalk cliffs. Through the deep blue dusk of the evening he went, and the gray blotched reach of the flat salt marshes with their dank yellowed grasses lay all about him. And overhead the cloud-spotted, moving gray of the sky, and beneath him the raging sea that called to him and called. He never stopped until he came to the weather-darkened shanty where she lived. He paused then at the gate. A lighted lamp was in one of the windows on the ground floor. The soft glow of it streamed in a long ladder of light out to him in the darkness. He opened the gate and went haltingly across the yard, and after a moment's hesitation he knocked at the door. At the far end of the street, the sea thudded over the yellow sanded beach, the pale stretch of it coming out of the grayness in a long white line. She answered his knock. The light from the lamp swept through the open doorway. Something in his face terrified her. Something that she had never before seen in those blue-green eyes, the color of the sea. What is it? What's happened? He stood there just looking down at her. Oh, mister, tell me, please, what is it? Her two hands went up to her throat and caught tightly at her neck. There's a storm. She looked out into the quiet, darkening evening. A storm? There's a bad storm. Coming? He could hardly say the words. She stared up at him. Her childlike eyes were very wide. Will it be soon? He never took his blue-green eyes from off her face. It's coming, quick. They're out, Pa and Will. He said it very quietly then. That's why I'm here. How can we get them back? Oh, little girl, he muttered. Little girl. How, mister? How? I'll get a boat. There's Sam Wilkins' smack, down there at the wharf. We could take that. Then, I'll go after them. They went from the door together down the street and out onto the back patch of the wharf. Through the grayness, they could see the boat rocking on the water at the farther end, the wail of the rising wind, the pounding of the sea, and close to them the muffled, bumping sound of the smack thrown again and again at the long wooden piles of the wharf. For a second they stood quite still. I'm going, he said. Her arms went suddenly up around his neck. Her lips brushed across his. He felt her body shivering. He caught and held her to him. And then he let her go and went quickly to the end of the wharf and pulled the boat alongside and stepped into it. He looked up at her standing there against the gray sky. He could see the white patches of her face and her hands and the pale mass of her hair that the wind had loosened. And down through the draggling grayness, he distinctly saw her childlike eyes searching for his. Before he could stop her, she was in the boat. Get back. I'm going. Quick, get back. I'm going with you. You can't. You don't know. I'm not afraid. Honest, I'm not. You don't know what it means. I'm not afraid. Little girl, I ain't going if you go. You've got to go. He repeated her words. I've got to go. If you don't take me with you, he had never heard her voice like that. I'll come out myself. You can't leave me. You can't. The rain began then. Great drops of it fell into his face. The whining of the wind was terrific. You don't know what it means. I do know. Oh God, I do. He caught up his oars then. He rowed with all his strength. The whole thing was so strange to him. Her going. Their being out on the water. The rowing. The waves rose in tremendous black swells all about them. The rain and the spray drenched them. The wind rocked the small boat. The whistling wail of it. The lowering clouds sprawled pitchy sky. He pulled in silence until they came to the nets. She stood up in the boat and called. Again and again her voice rose into the wind. Sit down, he told her. A distant shout answered her. He bent to his oars, then till he came to the cluster of smacks on the other side of the nets. Pa, she cried. Sally, what you doing here? Pa, there's a storm. I can see that. Pa, come on back to shore. You get on back, Sally. It'll blow over. She turned to him then. You tell him, she said it desperately. You tell him. He waited until he got just alongside of the fishing smack. It's going to be a bad one. He said it slowly. He thought then that the angry swirling of the sea became more infuriated, that the swell of the waves was greater. Far in the distance he heard the inhuman, piercing shriek of the seagulls. Who's that there, Sally? It's me. He saw that both of the men in the smack leaned toward him. What? It's me. You. Go on back, Pa. We'll make him go on back. Get the others to go. Please, Pa, please. For answer, he heard the man shout to the other boats about the nets. Storm, lads. Make for shore. He saw a moment's hesitation in that cluster of fishing smacks, and then one by one he watched them pull away from the nets and row toward the beach. He reached out his hand and caught hold of the other boat's gunwale. Make the little girl go back with you. Come on, Sally. Hop across there. Pa'll help you. We'll follow you, Pa. All right. Tell the little girl to go with you. With me? Tell her. You go on, Pa. We'll come right after you. He felt the boat at his side give a quick lurch. His hand slipped into the water. He could feel the sea pulling at it. His own smack rocked perilously for a second, and then he saw the girl's father and brother rowing toward the beach. What did you do that for? She did not answer him. A wave broke over the bow of his boat. In the darkness, he could see her crawling on her hands and knees along the bottom of the smack to him. He reached down and caught her up in his arms. Will they get back safe? She whispered it. Yes, sure. They're there now. And then the storm broke. The lightning flashed in zigzagging, blindly flares across the dark of the sky. The thunder rumbled in clattering crescendo. The sea tore and swirled and sucked. Wave after wave broke over the small boat. She rocked and pitched and swiveled. The oars were washed away. The rain and the wind stung them with their fury. The spray cut into their faces. From far off came the uncanny, inhuman, piercing sound of the seagulls shrieking. He knew then that the time had come. He held her very close to him. He had filched his soul from the sea. He who was something come from the sea, and of the sea, and always belonging to the sea. He had betrayed the sea. Little girl, I'm not afraid. Little girl, I couldn't stay on without you. I always knew, always, that sometime you'd go back. You're not scared? Just hold me tight. The foam-covered seething breadth of the water churning itself into white spumed frenzy. The dark, lowering skies. The black deep pull of the sea. Tighter. Next story. Flowers. The night wind brought him the smell of flowers. For a moment he fought against the smothering oppression of the thing he hated. For a second, the same struggle against its stifling weight. His eyes closed with the brows above them drawn and tight. His teeth caught savagely at his lower lip, gnawing at it until the blood came. His hands, the fingers wide spread, the veins purple and standing out, moved slowly and tensely to his throat. How he dreaded it! How he abominated the thing! How he loathed the subtle, insidious fragrance! How he abhorred flowers, flowers! With a tremendous, forcing effort, he opened his eyes. The same garden, the same sweeping reach of flowers. Flowers as far as he could see. Gigantic blossoming clumps of rhododendron, slender, fragile lilies of the valley showing white and faint on the deep green leaves. Violets somewhere. He got the sickeningly sweet scent of them. Early roses growing riotously. He detested the perfume of roses. Overhead, the darkening sky that held in the west the thin gray crescent of the coming moon. And all through the garden the first dull blue shadows of evening. Shadows that blurred around the shapes of flowers. Shadows that spread over the flowers, smearing out the spotting color of them until they were a gloom-splotched, ghostly mass. Shadows that brought out in all its pungent power the assailing, suffocating smell of the flowers. He stood there waiting. He could feel his heartbeats throbbing in his temples. His breath came in long, racking gasps. His one thought was to breathe regularly. 1, 2. He tried to think of something other than his breathing. The intangible odor of the flowers choked him with their stealthy cunning. It was always like this at first. He had always to contend silently and with all his strength against this elusive, abominated thing poured out to him by the flowers. His strangling intaking of breath. 1, 2. Never in all his life had he been without his horror of flowers. Never until now had he known why he hated them. Lately he had begun to wonder if they hated him. It would be better when she came. They were her flowers. Her flowers that took all her time, all her thoughts, all her caring and affection. Her flowers that grew all about her. Her flowers that held her away from him. He hated her flowers. 1, 2. It would be quite all right when she was there. Her flowers would not harm her. And then he heard the soft, uneven rustling of her skirts. He looked up to see her walking toward him down the long lane of her flowers. Through the drenching grayness he could see that she wore the same light dress that made her tall and clung to her in folds so that her figure seemed to bend. He could distinguish the heavy shadowy mass of her uncovered hair. Her eyes, set far apart and dark, fixed themselves on him. A quick light flooded into them. In the dusk he saw that her hands were clasped together and that they were filled with lilies. "Throw them away," he said when she stood beside him. "They're so pretty," she told him, staring down at the lilies. "You'll let me keep these, just this once?" "Throw them away," he repeated. "I can't stand the sight of them. You know that. Why must you go on picking the things and picking them?" She shrugged her shoulders. Her eyes left his face. "I love them," she said simply. "Love?" He laughed. "How can you love flowers?" "Oh, but I can." Well, I can't. He had been wanting her to know that for a long while. Why not? She asked him. He could not bring himself to tell her why not. Throw them away. She let the lilies sift through her fingers one by one, and then the last fell to the ground. Are you satisfied? No, he said. What good does it do, anyway? The next time it'll be the same again. It always is. She reached out a hand and touched his arm. But I never know when you're coming. If I knew, I wouldn't be picking flowers. I can't help having them in my hands when you come, if I don't know. Can I? It isn't that. He covered her hand, lying on his arm with his hand. What is it, then? She pulled her fingers from under his and drew away a bit. He made up his mind to try and tell her. It's the flowers. I should have told you long ago. Even at the beginning when I first came here, She interrupted him. When was that? How long ago? How can I tell? Ages ago. It does seem, she said it slowly. It does seem as if you had always come here. I can't remember the time when you didn't come. It's strange, isn't it? Because, there was a time when you weren't here. That was when I began with the flowers. I wish you'd never begun, he muttered. That's what I've got to say to you. I hate flowers. I've always hated them. I never quite knew why till I came here and found you loving them so much. You never think of anything or talk of anything but your flowers. If you must know, that's why I hate them. How silly of you. He thought she smiled. It's not, he said. There's nothing silly about it. I'd like to have you think of other things. There are plenty of other things. I want you to think of them. He broke off abruptly. What do you want? I want you. I can't say it. For a little while they were silent. It grew darker. The shadows that lay along the ground moved upward through the bushes of rhododendron. He watched the fantastic mesh of them shifting there. The gray of the crescent moon grew faintly yellow. His eyes roved over the shadow-splashed reach of flowers. The heavy odor of them sickened him. If only you'd try to like them. She said it wistfully. It's no use. I couldn't. If you worked among them the way I work, perhaps you could. I tell you I couldn't. But they're so lovely. Her hand went out and touched a rose. It's taken me years to perfect this one. You can't see in this light. But during the day, why don't you ever come here during the day? I don't know, he told her quite truthfully. During the day, she went on, you ought to see it. It's yellow, almost gold, and its center, that's quite pink with the very middle bit almost scarlet. I love this rose. He thought then that he could smell the particular fragrance of the one rose permeating subtly through the odor of all those other flowers. She loved that yellow and gold and scarlet rose. Good heavens, he said, do stop telling me how much you love your flowers. If you were with them all the time. He did not let her finish. That's all you do, isn't it? Just care for your flowers all day long? Why, yes. She was surprised. Of course it's all I do. It's all I care about doing. It takes every minute of my time. You know that, don't you? Yes, I know it. His tone was gruff. Then why do you always talk about it like this? She asked him. I've done it for years. Ever since I can remember. It's hard work, but I like doing it. I don't think you know how alone I've always been. I'm afraid you don't realize that. Not really, anyway. I've just never had anything to care about until I started in with the flowers. I don't know if I ought to tell you. She stopped speaking quite suddenly. What? I don't think you'd like to know what I was going to say. Tell me, he insisted. Well, she spoke slowly. Sometimes I feel as though it's so hard to say. But sometimes I feel as if the flowers know how much I care and as if they care too. Why'd you say that? I don't quite know. Only they're living things. They are, aren't they? I suppose they are. But that's no reason for you to encourage yourself in all those queer ideas about them. Queer ideas? You know the sort of thing I mean. I don't. What sort? He thought then that her voice had a hurt sound drifting through it. Loving them. For one thing. But what can I do? What else have I to love? I've just told you how much alone I am. All the time. Really. The flowers are the only things I have. I've just told you that." He waited a second. "You have me," he said. "You? But you hardly ever come. I'm so lonesome. You can't know what that means. I am lonely. And you, why? Sometimes I think you're not real. Not even real. Don't. For God's sake, don't say that. I can't help it. I tell you, I can't. It's all right now. It's always all right when you're here. But after you go, nothing is real to me. Nothing but the flowers. And you don't want me to care for them. You keep saying you hate them. They're all I've got. Won't you? Can't you see that? But if I come here to stay? To stay? Would you want me here?" He saw her hands move upward until they lay in 2 white spots on her breast. "Want you? If only you knew." He waited a moment before he said it. "And you could love me? I've always loved you." She spoke in a whisper. "I'll find a way," he told her. "There must be a way. But how? How? I don't know. I never thought about it before. I never knew you cared. I thought it was just the flowers. Nothing but the flowers. I hate the flowers. The feel of them, the sight of them, the smell of them. I couldn't ever come here without being suffocated. I was jealous of them, fearfully jealous. And I thought," her voice was low, "I thought that because I feel they love me, because I love them, somehow they brought you here. And when I come, when?" Her voice itself trailed to a whisper. "I will come to you. I will. How can you find me? Somehow I will. If only you could. I am lonely. Terribly lonely. If it would be soon. It must be soon. I'll wait for you always. But if you are real, you'll come soon. It's lonely, waiting. And I don't even know if you are. I don't even know." The Reverend William Cruthers started from his chair. Someone had banged the window closed. Someone had lit the lamp on the center table. Its yellow light trickled through the room and over the scant, old-fashioned furniture and crept upwards across the book-lined walls. The room was stuffy and close. The smell of flowers had gone. "Billy!" He turned to see his sister rushing across the room to him. He stooped a bit and caught her in his arms. "Why, Gina? I didn't know. Why didn't you write and tell me? Who brought you up from the station?" The girl kissed him hastily and enthusiastically on either cheek. "A nice welcome home." She laughed breathlessly. "I was just about to make a graceful and silent exit. But Gina, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. You couldn't. I wouldn't write. I wanted to surprise you. Aren't you surprised, Billy?" "Awfully," he conceded. "Awfully." Her brows puckered. "Very much so, I mean. You never do know just what you do mean. Do you, William?" "Naturally, I do. It wouldn't be natural for you if you did." The girl slid away from him and went and perched herself comfortably on the arm of the chair in which he had been sitting. Her hands were busy with her hat pins, and her eyes that peered up at him were filled with laughter. "How did you get up from the station, Gina?" "Oh, such a lovely way, Billy, and so very energetic for me. I walked. Now, what do you know about that?" He frowned a bit. "Very good for you, I don't doubt." He said it stiffly. "After all the motoring you must have done with those friends of yours." She had gotten her hat off. She sat dangling it by the brim. The lamplight streaked over her hair. "Now, don't be nasty, William. And whatever you do, don't speak to me as if I were a congregation. The Trents are perfectly lovely people, even if they are terribly rich and not very Christian. And Georgie Trent is a sweet boy. And," she added it hastily, "Wood Mills is a duck of a place." He thrust his hands into his coat pockets. "I never said it wasn't, Gina." She paid no attention to him. Her legs were crossed. Her one foot was swinging to and fro. Her eyes were fixed speculatively on the foot. "And you ought to be very glad to have me here again. Suppose I'd listened to Georgie and married him right off, instead of coming back here. A nice fix you'd have been in." You know perfectly well no one in all the world does for you as nicely as I do. You know that, don't you? He smiled down at her. To be sure I do. As a matter of fact, she went on, when I came in here you were half, if not altogether, asleep in this chair. I wasn't asleep, Gina. Oh, that's what you always say. But I banged in, and you didn't hear me. I lighted the lamp, and you didn't seem particularly conscious of it. And the window was wide open. I closed that for you. The wind was bringing in just yards of those flower smells you hate so. Was it, Gina? Ha ha. You smelled them then? His tone was strangely quiet. Of course I did. Come and sit here, Billy. She wiggled herself into a more comfortable position on the arm of the chair. And tell your Aunt Lia's sister how much you love her. He went and sat beside her in the chair. He put his arm about her waist. You're a dear child, Gina. I know it. She snuggled close to him. And I've had the most divine time, Billy. Wood Mills is a glorious place. There wasn't an awful lot to do, but whatever we did was great fun. You'd have a good time anywhere, little sister. Would I? Her eyes wavered about the room a bit hungrily. Something in her voice pulled his eyes up to her face. Gina, what is it? Nothing, Billy. She felt his fingers tighten at her side. Aren't you happy here, Gina? Of course I am, Billy. Her head was thrown back so that the long line of her throat showed in its firm, molded whiteness. Only, Billy, I don't think I even know what I want. Only just sometimes I feel it. A want that, perhaps, isn't even mine. It's for something, well, for something that doesn't feel here. He stroked her hand. It's lonesome for you, Gina. No, it isn't that. It's just, I guess it's just that I worry about you. Me, Gina? Yes, Billy. Sometimes you look so starved. That's what makes me think it's your want I feel. Yours that you want very much, and Billy, that you can't get hold of. No, Gina, no. She pressed her cheek against his. Oh, Billy. She spoke quickly. There was one place out there, Atwood Mills. You wouldn't have liked it, but it was too wonderful. He drew a deep breath of relief at the sudden change in her voice. What was it, Gina? Why wouldn't I have liked it? She fidgeted a bit. Why? Oh, because... Because what, Gina? It was just one big estate, Billy. A girl owns it. She's an orphan. She's very beautiful. She lives there all by herself except for a couple of old servants. Claire Trent and I saw her once or twice when we rode through the place. Claire says she's sort of queer. She doesn't bother about people. She doesn't like them, Claire says. She spends all her time around the place. That sounds very strenuous, Gina. Oh, it isn't, Billy. It's lovely. The estate is. I've heard the places there are pretty. But this one, Billy. In her enthusiasm, she leaned eagerly forward. You couldn't imagine it. There are miles and miles. And the whole thing, Claire says the whole year round. It's just one big mass of flowers. In spite of himself, he pulled his arm away from the girl's waist. Oh, is it? Billy, I know you don't like flowers. But this, you've never seen anything like this? There are probably lots and lots of places like it, little sister. Oh no. Her tone was vehement. There couldn't be. Not such a garden. All rhododendrons and lilies of the valley. Is anything wrong, Billy? Nothing. Those flowers grow in all gardens at this time of the year. She stared into his blanched face, and her brows drew together in a puzzled frown. Not like this, Billy. Really. I've never seen such rhododendrons or such lilies. And the violets and roses. He got to his feet suddenly. What? He asked hoarsely. What flowers did you say? Why, rhododendrons and lilies. And lilies. What is it, Billy? Go on, Gina. Go on. Billy. Lilies of the valley and violets, Gina. And roses, she finished mechanically. What kind of roses, Gina? The puzzled frown left her face. Glorious roses, Billy. She was enthusiastic again. There've never been roses like these. Why, there's one kind of a rose. It's known all over now. It took her years and years to grow it. What sort of a rose, Gina? What sort did you say? I didn't say, Billy. I don't even know the name of it. But it's a yellow rose, almost gold. And its center is pink and scarlet. For a moment they were silent. Did you see this woman, Gina, often? Oh, once or twice, Billy. When, Gina? In the evenings, each time. Where was she, Gina? Why, how strange you are, Billy. Where, Gina? Tell me, Jew here. Tell me where. In her garden, Billy. What's there to get so excited about? He fought for his control then. I'd like to know, Gina, where you saw her and Anne? The girl interrupted him. I saw her in the evenings, in her garden. She used to walk down, well, it looked like a long lane of flowers. To be exact, Billy, it was always in the evening and kind of gray, so I couldn't see very much except that she wore a light, clingy sort of dress. She stopped for a second. Yes, Gina? His voice was more quiet now. I told you she was a bit queer, didn't I? Queer? God. She was lonesome, Gina. Yes, the girl caught at his last words. I'll bet she was lonesome. Anyone would be, living like that. That's what makes her queer, I guess. I saw her both times with my own eyes come down the garden with her hands full of flowers. Both times I saw her stand quite still. And then Claire and I would see her drop her flowers to the ground. That was the funny part. She didn't throw them away. It wasn't that, you know. No, Gina. She dropped them, one by one. As if what, Gina? Oh, as if she were being made to do it. He went to his knees then. He buried his head in the girl's lap. She leaned anxiously forward, her hands smoothing his hair. Billy, dear, aren't you well? Billy, tell me. He could not bring himself to speak. Billy, is this what you do when I come home to you? Shame on you, Billy. Why, Billy? Aren't you glad to have me here? Say, aren't you? Thank God, he whispered. Thank God. He got to his feet then. The girl rose from her chair and clung to him. I've never seen you like this, Billy. Listen, Gina. His voice was low. When you go upstairs to take off your things, pack my grip, little sister. I'm going away. Away, Billy? Yes, Gina. But where, Billy? To a place where I've wanted to go for a very long time, little sister. But, Billy, will you do that for me? Now, Gina, I want to leave. When, Billy? As soon as I can, Gina. It must be soon. The girl went out of the room very quietly. He crossed over to the window and threw it open. Darkness as far as he could see. Darkness in which were smudged lighter things without shape. Somewhere in the distance, the feathery ends of branches brushed their leaves to and fro against the sky. He knew that the wind was stirring. He looked up at the heavens, gray and dark save where the thin crescent moon held its haunting yellow light that was slurred over by drifting clouds and then held again. He could see the wind driving the clouds. The swish of the wind out there going through those smudged lighter things without shape. He leaned far over the sill. And suddenly the night wind brought him the smell of flowers. Gradually the odor of the flowers, blending subtly and faint at first, grew more distinct, heavier. He stood there smiling. Flowers. Her. Flowers. I'm coming, he whispered. I'm coming to you now, dear. Next story. The Shadow. He was colossally vain. He lived with his wife Ellen in the small house on Peachtree Road. There was nothing pretentious about the house. There were any number of similar houses along the line of Peachtree Road. For that matter, the house was the kind planted innumerable times in the numerous suburbs of the large city. Still, it was his house, his own. That meant a lot to him whenever he thought of it, and he thought of it often enough. He liked to feel the thing actually belonged to him. It emphasized his being to himself. The house was a two-storied affair built of wood and whitewashed. A green mansard roof came down over the small green shuttered upper windows. On the lower floor, the windows were somewhat larger with the same solid wooden green shutters. A gravel path led up to the front door. Two drooping willow trees stood on either side of the wicker gate. Before the time when his aunt had died and had left him the house, he had not been particularly successful. At the age of 41, he had found himself a hard-working journalist and nothing more. He had had no ambition to ever be anything else. He was at all times so utterly confident that the work he was doing was quite right, chiefly because it was the work that he was doing. No man had a more unbounded faith in himself. At that time, he had not been conscious of his lack of success. Now, of course, he looked back on it all as a period of development, something which had prepared him for this that was even then destined to come. He told himself that in this small house, away from the surrounding clatter and nuisances of the city, he had found time to write, to be himself, to really express what he knew himself to be. He had become tremendously well known in that space of 6 years. No one ever doubted the genius of Jasper Wald. He wrote as a man writes who is actually inspired. His books were read with interest and surprisingly favorable comment. There was something different, something singularly appealing in all of Jasper Wald's works. At that time, his conceit was inordinate. It extended to a sort of personal, physical vanity. In itself, that was grotesque. There was absolutely nothing attractive in the loosely jointed, stoop-shouldered body of him, or for that matter in the narrow head covered with sparse blonde gray hair. The eyes of him were of rather a washed blue and bulged a bit from out their sockets. The nose was a singularly squat affair, at the same time too long. The mouth was unpleasantly small with lips so colorless and thin that the line of it was like some weird mark. Yet he was vain of his appearance. But then his egoism was the keynote of his entire being. Some people could not forgive it in him, even when they acknowledged him as a writer and praised his work. The man in literature was spoken of as a mystic, a poet, a possessor of subtlety that was close to genius. In actual life, Jasper Wald was an out-and-out materialist. As for his wife, Ellen, she was rather a tall woman, thin but not ungraceful. Her features were good, very regular, still somewhat nondescript, all but her eyes. Her eyes were strange, green in color, and so heavily lidded that one could rarely see the expression of them. Then, too, she had an odd manner of moving. There never seemed to be any effort or any abruptness in whatever she did. Even her walk was sinuous. He had married her when they both were young. Through his persistent habit of ignoring her, she had been dwarfed into a nonentity. To have looked at the woman, one would have said that hers was a distinctive personality unbelievably suppressed. It would not have been possible for anyone living with Jasper Wald to have asserted himself. Perhaps she had learned that years before. Certainly his was the character which predominated, domineered through the encouragement of his own egoism. Her attitude toward him was perpetually one of self-effacement. She stood for his conceit in a peculiarly passive way. If it ever irritated her, she gave no sign. And he kept right on with his semi-indulgent manner of patronizing her stupidity. That is, when he noticed her at all. She was essential to him in so far as she supplied all of his physical wants. Those in themselves were of great importance to Jasper Wald. There was no companionship between them. Jasper Wald could never have indulged in companionship of any kind. He had put himself far beyond that. To his way of thinking, he was a super being who had no need whatever for the rest of man. He was all self-sufficient. If there had ever been love between them in those days when they had first come together, they had both of them completely lost sight of it. He in his complacent conceit, she in her monotonous negation. And as time went on, and as his work became greater, Jasper Wald grew even further away from the sort of thing he wrote, so that it was more than ever difficult for those who knew him to disassociate him from his writings. There was always the temptation to try to find some of his literary idealism in himself, to find some of his prosaic realism in his works. On one occasion, Delafield, his publisher, came to him, to the house on Peachtree Road. It was a peculiarity of Jasper Wald's to persistently refuse any request to leave his home. It was the one thing about which he was superstitious. He had never by word or thought attributed his success to anyone or anything outside of himself. He had made his name in this house, and he would not leave it. Delafield's visit came at a time just after Jasper Wald's last book had been published. Sitting in the square, simply furnished living room, Delafield, for all his enthusiasm for the author, had felt a certain inexplicable disgust. "It's great, Wald. There's genius to it. We'll have it run through its second edition a week after we put it on the market." I don't doubt that. Jasper Wald's tone was matter-of-fact in his confidence. Not for a moment. Delafield bit off the end of his cigar. "When will your next one be ready?" He asked it abruptly. "Oh, I don't know." Jasper Wald had pulled leisurely at his pipe. "Whenever I make up my mind to it, I suppose. It's going to be the biggest thing I've tackled yet, Delafield." "Well," Delafield got up to go, "it can't be too soon. You'll have a barrel of money before you get done. Genius doesn't usually pay that way either." But he could not help himself. "You've got the knack of the thing. Heaven knows where you get it. But it's the knowledge we all need that comes from." He broke off quite suddenly as Ellen Wald came into the room. "I didn't know," she said uncertainly. "I thought you were alone." "My wife, Delafield." Jasper Wald made the introduction impatiently. "Ellen, this is Mr. Delafield, who publishes my books." She came toward them and held out her hand to Delafield. He could not help but noticing her odd manner of moving. "Good evening," she said. Delafield had not known that Jasper Wald was married. It was almost impossible for him to imagine anyone living with this man. He looked at the woman curiously. He had the feeling that her individuality had been stultified. It did not surprise him. Jasper Wald could have accomplished that. It would have been difficult to have matched him with as flagrantly material a person as he himself was. Only that sort of person would have stood a chance with him. Any other would have had to fall flat. She had fallen flat. Delafield knew that the moment he looked at her. "Why, I didn't know." Delafield took her hand in his. "You never told me, Wald, that you were married." "Didn't I?" "No, of course not, Dot. But about the new book, Delafield." Delafield dropped her hand. He had never felt anything quite as inert as that hand. It impressed the nondescript quality of her upon him even more strongly than had her appearance. "Your husband has promised me another book, Mrs. Wald." He spoke slowly. He felt he had to speak that way, or she would not understand him. "Your husband is a great author, Mrs. Wald." "Yes." "Why don't you say genius, Delafield, and be done with it? Why don't you make a clean breast of it with genius?" "I've got to be going." Delafield felt a strange irritation. The man was a fool. For what reason under the sun could this woman with those half-closed eyes let herself be dominated by him? The two of them got on his nerves. "Won't you stay to dinner?" Jasper Wald was obviously anxious for a chance to speak of himself. "Sorry, Wald. I've got to be getting on." Delafield still watched the woman. She stood there quite silent. "I thought you might have something to say about that book of mine." "No, there's nothing more." Delafield started for the door. "I've just told you that it's full of the sort of knowledge all of us are in need of. I can't say more, you know. I suppose that knowledge is what constitutes genius." But he was staring now full into those bulging blue eyes. "Lord, man, where'd you get it from?" Glancing at the woman, Delafield saw that she was looking straight at him. Her eyes met his in a way which he was completely at a loss to explain. There was something eerie about it. "Where does he get it?" She repeated his question stupidly, and once again the heavy lids came down over those strange green eyes, hiding all expression. Jasper Wald drew in his breath. "I write it," he said. After that, Delafield left them both severely alone. The woman puzzled him. He could not tolerate the man, Jasper Wald, and he could not for worlds have the genius of Jasper Wald hurt or slighted in any way. He knew how big it was. It often left him breathless. But the man, he would have liked to have hit him that day in the living room in the house on Peachtree Road, to have kicked him into some sort of a realization as to what an utter little rat he was. And so, because of his physical makeup, people stayed away from Jasper Wald. Not that he avoided people, not that he wanted to live the life of a recluse. He never made any attempt to conceal his living from the general public. He was too much of the egoist to attempt concealment of any kind. So his life was known to any man, woman, or child who cared for the knowledge. His life of narrow selfishness, of tranquil complacency, of colossal conceit, and of genius. He always wrote in the evenings, did Jasper Wald, and often he would keep at his writing well on into the morning. He liked to sit there in the square, old-fashioned living room with its wide window that gave out upon Peachtree Road. When he had first moved into the house as an obscure, hard-working journalist, he had placed the desk against the window ledge so that he could look directly out of the window without moving. And he had kept the desk there. He was just a bit insistent about it. Then, too, he liked the blind up so that he could stare out into the evening and at the house opposite. For all his impossible vanity, there must have been embedded deep down in the small, hard soul of the man some excessive, frantic hunger of self-recognition by others, a potential desire to accomplish an assertion of self that could in no way be denied, a fundamental energy which had in some way made possible the work, but which he could never admit for fear that it might evade the importance of himself. The house opposite interested him tremendously. Sitting there in an abstract fit of musing, he watched it as one subconsciously watches a place that has one's attention. To all outward appearances, the house across the way was heavily boarded up and closed. It had always been closed since the time that Jasper Wald had come to live in Peachtree Road. Yet every evening in the window directly facing his, he had seen the shadow of a man moving to and fro, beyond the drawn blind. He would sit there watching the dark, undefined shadow until he felt that he had to work, and then the whole thing would slip from his mind until the following evening when he would again be at his desk. Strangely enough, he had never mentioned the presence of the shadow to anyone. There was about it a certain mysterious unreality. That much he, Jasper Wald, was capable of knowing. It was the one thing outside of himself that gripped at his intelligence. During all those 6 years, he had waited at his desk each night for the coming of the shadow. And when it came, he had started to work. He never explained the thing to himself. He never thought he had to explain anything to his own understanding. Had he tried, he would have been utterly at a loss for an explanation. So Jasper Wald had come to look upon the shadow as a sign of luck, a superstition-fostered thing that epitomized his genius to himself. Naturally, it had not always been that way. The first time that Jasper Wald had felt the shadow, he had experienced an uncanny sense of terror. That had been before he had really seen it. He had been standing there beside the window just after he and Ellen had moved into their home, looking out at the closed house opposite. He had felt a queer oppression which he readily interpreted as the vibration of his new environment. When the thing had persisted, he had become a bit uneasy. The sense of oppression, so utterly unknown to him, had changed to one which grew upon him, as if he were being forced out of himself in some uncanny manner. There was about it all a curious sensation of remoteness of self, and at the same time a weird consciousness of the haunting permeation of something invisible and dynamic. He never thought back to that evening without a positive horror. The whole thing was so completely alien to him. It had been with a great sense of relief that he had, finally, been able to see and to rivet his attention upon the shadow there against the blind of the house opposite. He had clinched his thought onto it, and the other thing had left him, had lessened in its maddening oppression. That evening he had started to write. He had felt that writing was a thing he had to do. It was entirely because of his first fear that he kept the knowledge of the shadow to himself. Cocksure as he was of himself, thoroughly certain of his genius, and inordinately vain of his success, there was one thing about it all that Jasper Wald could not quite make out. Not for worlds would he have admitted it. Still, there was the one thing. And the one thing was that Jasper Wald could not understand the kind of thought behind what he himself wrote. It was late one summer evening that Jasper Wald sat at his desk in the square living room. His pen was in his hand. A pile of blank paper made a white patch on the dark wood before him. His blue eyes that bulged a bit looked out into the graying half-light. The green of the lawn was matted with dark shadows. A mist of shadows were pressed into the faint-lined leaves of the two drooping willow trees on either side of the wicker gate. An unreal light held in the sky. His eyes were fixed on the one window of the house opposite. With his pen in his hand, Jasper Wald waited. From somewhere in the house came the chimes of a clock striking the half-hour. Starting from his chair, Jasper Wald went to the side of the desk and leaned far out of the window. A wave of heat came up to him from the earth. His eyes stared intently at the window opposite. The door behind him was thrown open. He turned to see Ellen's tall, not ungraceful, figure standing in the doorway. Her two hands grasped the bowl of a lighted lamp. "I don't need that." Jasper Wald told it to her impatiently. She came a step into the room. "It's dark in here, Jasper." "But I don't need any more light, Ellen." "I don't need it, I tell you." "It's dark in here, Jasper." "All right then, put the thing down. I can't take up my time arguing with you. How can a man write in a place like this, anyway? Have you no consideration? Must I always be disturbed? Have you no respect for genius?" She came a step further toward the center of the room. "Genius, Jasper?" "My genius, Ellen. Mine." He watched her cross the room with that odd, sinuous moving of hers and placed the lamp in the center of his desk. And then he saw her go to a chair within its light and, sitting down, pick up some sewing which she had left there. He went back and sat at his desk. He had made up his mind that this new book of his would be something big, something bigger than he had ever done before. He wanted to write a stupendous thing. He caught up his pen and dipped it in the ink. She startled him with a quick cough. "Can't you be still?" He turned toward her. "You know I can't write if I'm bothered. You don't have to sit in here if you're going to cough your head off. There are plenty of other rooms in the house." She half rose from her chair. "Do you want me to go?" "Oh, sit there," he muttered irritably. "Only, for heaven's sake, be still." Yes, Jasper. All of his books had brought him fame. But this one would bring him fame with something else. This book would be the great work that would show to people the staggering power of one man's mind. His mind. His eyes that stared at the window of the house opposite came back to be a pile of blank paper which made a white patch on the dark wood before him. Without any definite idea, he began to write. A word, a sentence, a paragraph. He tore the thing up without stopping to read it. Ellen's dull-toned voice came to him through the stillness of the room. "Anything wrong, Jasper?" "Wrong? What should be wrong?" "I don't know." He began to write again. He looked out of his window at the window of the house opposite. He went on with his writing till he had covered the whole page. Again he tore the paper up and threw it from him. "I'm going, Jasper." He turned to see her standing in the center of the room, her heavily lidded eyes fixed on the floor. "I told you you could stay here." "I'd best be going, Jasper." "Sit down over there, and do be still. I seem to bother you. You haven't started to write. Is it because I'm here, Jasper?" "You," he snorted contemptuously. "What you got to do with it?" "I don't know," she said quietly, and she went back to her chair. Again his eyes were fixed on that one window. He leaned forward quickly. His hands gripped the chair's arms on either side of him. His brows drew down together above the bulging blue eyes. Thrown on the clear blank of the window blind, moving to and fro across it, went the shadow. With a sharp sigh of relief, Jasper Wald began to write. It was not until he had gotten far down the page that he became suddenly conscious of Ellen, standing directly behind him. He looked over at the window. The shadow was still there. "What is it? What you want?" The lamplight brought out her features, good and very regular and still somewhat nondescript. The lamplight showed her strange green eyes, and beneath the heavy lids the lamplight brought out in a glinting streak the expression of the eyes themselves. "What made you do that, Jasper?" "I'm trying to write. You keep interrupting me." "What are you talking about?" "Made me do what?" "Made you write, Jasper." "Don't I always write?" "Yes, Jasper, always. All of a sudden, like that." "Well, what of it?" What makes you do it, Jasper? Oh, Lord, can't you leave me alone? Do you know what makes you do it, Jasper? Of course I know. Well, what? It's my inspiration. That comes, she spoke slowly, every night when you look out of the window. That's how it comes, Jasper. Look out of the window? Why shouldn't I look out of the window? What is it you see? Over there. In that house? In that one window? He looked across the way at the shadow moving to and fro against the window blind. He started to his feet so suddenly that his chair crashed to the floor behind him. He faced her angrily. What under the sun's the matter with you? Nothing. Then why can't you leave me alone? I want to know, Jasper. You don't know what you want. Yes, Jasper. I want to know. Leave the room, he said furiously. Leave the room. I've got to write. She started for the door. You've got to write? Her words came back to him across the length of the room with a curious insistence. You've got to write, Jasper? He waited until the door closed behind her, and then he went back to his desk. What had she meant by that last question of hers? Didn't she know that he had to write? Didn't she realize that he had to write? And this book of his, this book that was to be the biggest thing that he had yet done. Ellen, he called. Ellen. He heard her feet coming toward him along the passageway. She came back into the room as though nothing had happened. Yes, Jasper? What did you mean by that, Ellen? By what you just said? She faced him in the center of the room. I've been wanting to tell you, Jasper. Well? Her hands hung quite quietly at her sides. I've put up with you for a long time, Jasper. I haven't said very much, you know. What? He stuttered. Oh, yes, she went on evenly. If it weren't for your vanity, you'd have realized long ago what a contemptible little man you really are. He interrupted her. Ellen. His tone was astonished. You're so full of yourself that you can't see anything else. You're so full of that genius. Of yours. You don't have to speak of that. You can leave that out of it. You've nothing to do with it, with my genius. Your genius. She laughed then. It's your genius, Jasper, that has nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with me? No, Jasper. I haven't been blind. Blind. I've seen Jasper, sitting here night after night in this room with you. I've seen. What? Over there, in the house opposite. You mean? And you can't write without it, Jasper. You couldn't write before, and you can't write now without it. It isn't you. It isn't you who writes. It's something working through you. And you call it your own. Jasper, you're a fool. Ellen, how dare you? Dare. She spoke the word disdainfully. He had never in his whole life seen her this way. He had never thought to see her like this. But then, he had never given Ellen much thought of any kind. It's you who are the fool. He was furious. It's I who've always been the brains. If you could, you'd have hampered me with your stupidity. But you couldn't. I shut you quite outside. I nurtured my own genius. If I'd have left things to you, I'd have been down and out by now, and that's all there is to it. No. Her voice rang through the room. I won't let you say that, Jasper. I'll tell you the truth now, and take it or leave it as you will. You won't be able to get away from it. Not if I tell you the truth, Jasper. There'll be no getting away from it. Truth. About what? You and your genius. I wouldn't have told you, but it's no good going on like this. I thought there was some hope for you. I couldn't think any human being would be as self-satisfied, as disgustingly material as you are. Why? If you have a soul, but you haven't, and I thought, God, how I hoped. He started to speak. He could not find his voice. She went on presently in that quiet, monotonous voice which had been hers for so many years. You left me alone. I wouldn't have complained. I wouldn't complain now if you had some excuse for it. It all made me different. There's no use in telling you how. You couldn't understand. But I got to feeling things I'd never felt before. And then I saw things. And after a while I found I could bring those things to me. And that night, the first night we moved in here, He interrupted her in spite of himself. What of that night? What? That night when you were standing there at the window, I got down on my knees and prayed. I brought something to you that night, and you called the genius yours. She broke off and was silent for a second. I brought it to you because I wanted you to be great. I thought with all that energy of yours for writing that if it could work through you, you'd be big. But you were too small for it. You tried to make it a thing of your own, and I've held on to it. For 6 years I've kept it here with you, and now it's going. I'm letting it go back again. You're too small. You can't ever be anything but just you. He walked over to his desk and sank down into the armchair. I don't know what you're talking about. You do, and if you don't, why do you look out of the window there every night? Why'd you wait for it to come before you start to write? His exclamation was involuntary. The shadow. Yes, it's shadow. From this room where I kept it, casting over there, it's shadow. So that was what she meant. The superstition-fostered thing that epitomized his genius to himself. The shadow that he had come to look upon as a sign of luck. But it was nonsense. It wasn't possible. Not such rot as that. It was his mind. The big creative mind of him that wrote, "Have you said all you're going to say?" For a second her gaze met his, and then the heavy lids came down again over those strange green eyes, hiding all expression. Yes, Jasper. He looked out of the window. His eyes stared through the night beyond the two shadowy, drooping willow trees on either side of the wicker gate and over at the house opposite. He caught his breath. The yellow light from the lamp on his desk played across the clear blank of the window blind across the way. The shadow had gone. Ellen, his voice was hoarse. Ellen, what is it? It's not there, Ellen. 6 years now. Why, Ellen? She went and sat down in the chair beside the desk. Yes, it isn't there. I tell you, I thought it could make no difference to you. It was lucky, Ellen. Oh, lucky, Jasper. He made an effort to pull himself together. It won't make any difference to me, not to my writing, not to my genius. After the silence of a moment, her voice came to him in its low, even measure. Then, right? Of course. His tone was high-pitched, hysterical. Naturally, I'll write. Right, Jasper. He caught up his pen and dipped it in the ink. He drew the white pile of paper nearer to him. Jasper, how can I work if you don't stop talking? How can I do anything? How can I write? Are you writing, Jasper? Are you? He did not answer her. Because, she went on very quietly, it's gone back, Jasper. It's gone now. His pen went to and fro across the page. His figure was bent well over the desk. Every now and again, without moving, his bulging blue eyes would lift themselves to the clear blank blind of the window opposite, and then they would come back and fix themselves intently upon the white page of paper which he was so busily covering with stupid, meaningless little drawings. Next story. The Effigy. Mr. Evans is upstairs in the library, ma'am. Genevieve Evans hurried through the hall and up the steps. She pulled off her gloves as she went. She rolled them into a hard, small ball and tucked them automatically in her muff. She had hoped that she would get there before him. She had been thinking of that all during the quick rush home. She would have liked to have had a moment to pull herself together. After what she had been through, she wondered if she could keep from going all to pieces. It could not be helped. She did not even know if she cared a lot about it. She was quite numbed. He was there ahead of her, there in the library. Of all the rooms in the house, that he should have chosen the one so rarely used. The room she hated. At the door of the library, she paused breathless. For a second, she thought the long, dark room empty. Then she saw Ernest. He was standing in one of the deep windows. A short, squat figure, black against the dim yellow of the velvet curtains. One hand held his cigarette. The fingers of the other hand tapped unevenly on the window glass. She knew then that he must have seen her come into the house. Ernest. He turned. I've been waiting for you, he told her with studied indifference. Where have you been, Jenny? She took a step into the room. I'm sorry, Ernest. I didn't know you'd be home so early. It's late. Where have you been? She wondered why she should bother avoiding answering his question. Oh, out. Her tone was vague. No, he scoffed. I wouldn't have guessed it. Really, I wouldn't. She loosened the fur from her neck and tossed it onto the center table. Don't, Ernest. Don't what, Jenny? She sank down into the depths of the nearest chair. Oh, nothing. Her hands clenched themselves. Nothing. He came and stood quite close to her. He glanced quickly at her, puffing the while at his cigarette. She thought he looked wicked and pagan, hideous and yellow behind the rising smoke. His narrow eyes peered at her. Well, Jenny, out with it, my girl. Where have you been? She looked away from him. Her face was pale. In the twilight-shadowed room, he had seen how wide and strange her eyes were. She made up her mind then that it was not worth bothering about. She would tell him the truth. She did not care how he took it. I've been to see, Father. She whispered the words. Her eyes wavered back to his face. Good heavens! He laughed harshly. After all you said? Yes. Rather a joke, that. No, there wasn't anything funny about it. Well, was the old man surprised? No. He told me he knew I'd come, sometime. Wise old beggar, Daniel Dreher. Her breath came quickly, unevenly. He's a devil, Ernest. That's what he is. He interrupted her. Not so fast, Jenny. You went there to see him, you know. But, Ernest, I couldn't stand it any longer. I simply couldn't. He walked deliberately over to the screened fireplace and tossed his cigarette into it. Why'd you go to him? You know why I went. Why? She had felt right along that he must be made to understand it. She could not see why he had not known before. Oh, don't pretend anymore. I'm sick of it. You know I'm sick of it. His brows drew together in an angry frown. Sick of what? Jenny? Her eyes crept away from his and went miserably about the room. They took no note of the rare old furniture, of the dark paneled walls, of the color-mellowed tapestries. She sat looking at it all blindly. Then her eyes raised themselves a bit. She found herself staring at the picture hung just above the wood-carved mantel. The famous picture, the work of the great artist. The picture before which she had stood and hated, and hated. The picture which was the pride and portrait of her father, Daniel Dreher. She got to her feet. I'm sick of you, she said it quite calmly. And I'm sick of him. She nodded her head in the direction of the portrait. I'd do anything to get away from both of you. Anything. He smiled. You'll not get away from me, he told her. You. The one word was contemptuous. You don't really count. What you mean? He still smiled. I mean what I say. Her voice was tired. You're nothing. Nothing but, oh, a kind of a henchman to him. That's all you are. Not that he needs you. He doesn't need anyone. He's too unscrupulously powerful for that. He's never needed anyone. Not you. Nor me. He didn't even need my mother. He broke her heart and let her die because he didn't need her. I think you know he's like that. You're no different where he's concerned than the others. After all, I'm your husband. That's the ghastly part of it. You, my husband. You're only my husband because of him. You knew that when I married you, didn't you? You knew the lies he told me when he wanted me to marry you. You never contradicted them. And I was too silly, too young to know. I wanted to get away from it all, and from him. I couldn't guess that you think, Ernest, if it hadn't been for those lies I'd have married you. Do you? Oh, I don't know. I usually get what I want, Jenny. And why do you get it? Why? Perhaps because I want it. She laughed harshly. Because Daniel Dreher gets it for you. Because he's had everything all his life. Because he's behind you for the time being. That's why. And what if it is? My God, she muttered. I can't make you understand. I can't even talk to either of you. You went to see him. I went to him to tell him I couldn't stand it any longer. I begged him to help me. Just this, once. I told him I couldn't go on this way. I told him I couldn't bear any more. I told him the truth, that I'd go mad. What did he say? Jenny? For a second her eyes closed. He laughed. Of course. There's no of course about it. I'm serious. Deadly serious. Don't be a fool, Jenny. If you ask me, I'd say you were mighty well off. Your father gives you everything you want. Your husband gives you everything you want. There isn't a man in the whole city who has more power than Daniel Dreher, or more money for that matter. You ought to be jolly well satisfied. She waited a full moment before speaking. Maybe I'm a fool, Ernest. Maybe I am. A weak, helpless kind of a fool. But I'm not happy, Ernest. I can't go this kind of a life anymore. It's gotten unreal and horrible. And the kind of things you do to make money, the kind of things you're proud of, they prey on me, Ernest. There's nothing about all this that's clean. It's making me ill. The rottenness of this sort of living. I'm not happy. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Nonsense. You've no reason for not being happy. The trouble with you, Jenny, is that you've too lively an imagination. Oh no, Ernest. I've got to get away. Somewhere. Anywhere. Just by myself. I don't love you, Ernest. You don't really love me. It's only because I'm Daniel Dreher's daughter that you married me. It was just his wealth and his power and his unscrupulous self that fascinated you. You don't know what you're saying. I do, Ernest. You'd like to be like him, but you can't. You are like him in a lot of ways. The little ways. But you're not big enough to be really like him. Let me go, Ernest. Before it's too late. Let me go. He came and put a hand on her shoulder. I'll never let you go, he said. You must. She whispered. You've got to let me. Just to get away from all this. I've never been away in all my life. He'd never let me go either. Unconsciously her eyes went up to the picture. The full, red face with the hard lines in it. The thick, sensual lips. The small, cunning eyes that laughed. The ponderous, heavy set of the figure. The big, powerful hands. His gaze followed after hers. And very suddenly he left her side. He walked over to the mantel. Funny, he muttered to himself. Jolly strange, that. Her fingers clutched at her breast. Ernest, what are you doing? Can you see anything wrong here, Jenny? He was looking up at the portrait. Wrong. She said it beneath her breath. Wrong. He reached up a hand. He drew his fingers across the canvas. By Jove. His voice was excited. So it is. Thought I wasn't crazy. When could it have happened? Ever noticed this, Jenny? She could not take her eyes from his hand that was going over and over the canvas along the arm of the painted figure. Can't you see it, Jenny? I can't see anything. She whispered it. Come over here, where I am. She hesitated. Ernest, what's the sense? How can you see in this light anyway? How? He did not let her finish. Come here. Slowly she went toward him. What is it, Ernest? What? A crack? His hand still worked across it. In the paint, here along the arm. Or a cut, or something. How under the sun could it have happened? We've got to have it fixed somehow. Never heard of such a thing before. Old Daniel Dreher'll be as sore as a crab if ever he gets wind of this. It'd be like hurting him to touch this portrait. He certainly does think the world of it. How could it have happened? That's what I'd like to know. I don't know what you're talking about. Here. Can't you see it? It's as plain as the nose on your face. Along the arm. It's a cut. Right into the canvas. You can run your finger in it. Give me your hand. She shrank back from him. No, Ernest. He stared at her intently. You do look seedy. You'd better go up and lie down. I've got to dress for dinner anyway. We'll have to have this fixed. He started for the door. She blocked his way. Will you let me go, Ernest? Don't start that again. All right, I won't. That's a sensible girl, Jenny. Even your father had to laugh at you when you told him the way you feel. It isn't natural. It's just nerves, I guess. You could stick it out with Daniel Dreher. You can stick it out with me. Look here, Daniel Dreher's a great old fellow, but I'm not as crude in some things as he is. Am I, Jenny? You would be if you could. Her voice was sing-song. You haven't his strength, that's all. I'm not as crude as he is. You haven't his strength, she droned. I've enough strength to keep you here, if that's what you mean. No, it's not what I mean. A puzzled look crept across her face. Her eyes were suddenly furtive. Maybe I don't know what I mean, but I don't think it's you. I don't think you count. It's him. It's Daniel Dreher. He's behind it all. I don't think I quite know what I'll do about it. I must do something. I mustn't be angry. He stared at her. You'd best come along if you're going to dress. I'll be up in a moment, she said. When he was gone, she went over to the window. She stood there gazing out into the darkened, quiet side street. She was trembling in every limb. Now and again she would half turn. Her eyes would go slowly, warily toward the portrait hanging there over the mantel, and then they would hurry away again. She started nervously when the butler knocked at the door. What is it, Williams? Mr. Dreher's housekeeper, ma'am. She'd like to see you, ma'am. I said I'd ask. Show her in here, Williams. The man left the room. She walked over to the farther corner of the room and switched on the lights. She heard footsteps in the hall. She stood quite still, waiting. Footsteps, nearer. A middle-aged woman, very plainly dressed, was in the doorway. Miss Genevieve. Nanny. Miss Genevieve. I wouldn't have come, only I've got to tell you. What, Nanny? Come and sit down, Nanny. The woman came into the room. For a second she paused, and then hurriedly she closed the door behind her. No, Miss Genevieve. I'll not sit down. Thank you. I can't be staying long. He might want me. I wouldn't like him to know I was here. The muscles on either side of Genevieve Evans' mouth pulled and twitched. So? You're frightened too, Nanny? She said the words to herself. The woman heard her. That I am, Mississippi, and that I've got good reason to be. The same as you, my poor Miss Genevieve. Yes, yes, Nanny. What was it you wanted? The woman stood quite rigid. You was there, miss, this afternoon? Yes. Did you notice anything, miss? She drew a deep breath. What you mean, Nanny? Nanny, what? It's him, Mississippi. It was last night. The woman broke off. Yes, Nanny, Genevieve Evans urged. I don't rightly know how to tell it to you, Mississippi. It's hard to find the words to say it in. He'd kill me if he knew I come here and told you. But you got to know. I can't keep it to myself. He's been fierce of late. What with making so much more money. And the drinking, Mississippi. And the women. The women, they're there all hours now. My mother's house. Genevieve Evans said it uncertainly. Yes, miss, the woman went on. And it was almost as bad when she lived. I know, Nanny. I've always known. But last night, miss, after they'd gone, I was asleep, Miss Genevieve. It woke me. It was awful. Plain horrid, Mississippi. What, Nanny? The scream, miss, a shriek of pain. No, no, Nanny. Genevieve Evans interrupted wildly. Don't say it. Don't. The woman looked at her wonderingly. Why, Miss Genevieve, poor little lamb. Nanny, Nanny. She made a tremendous effort to control herself. What was it you were going to say? The scream, Mississippi. In the night, I rushed down. I knocked at his door. He wouldn't let me in. He was moaning, Mississippi, and cursing, and moaning. He was swearing about a knife. I listened, miss, at the keyhole. I was scared. He kept cursing and moaning about a knife, about his arm. Nanny. She whispered the word beneath her breath. Yes, Mississippi cut in the arm. He would have it that way, and he wouldn't let me in. I waited for hours, and this morning I went into his room myself. He was in his shirt sleeves. I pretended I wanted the linen for the wash. I was looking for blood, Mississippi. Not a drop did I find, not a pinprick stain, but I seen him bandaging his arm. Right in front of me he did it, and then I seen him rip the bandage off. Nanny, it's his reason I fear for, Mississippi. He turns to me and asks me if I can see the cut. Yes, yes, Nanny? He shows me his arm. And miss? The woman stopped abruptly. Nanny, what? What? Genevieve Evans' hands had gone up to her throat. There wasn't a scratch. Not a scratch? Oh, she breathed. And that's why I came here, Mississippi, to ask if he'd said anything of it to you. Or if you'd noticed anything, Mississippi. Genevieve Evans waited a full second before she answered. No, Nanny, he wouldn't have told me. I didn't notice anything. I wasn't there very long. You see, I only went to ask him to let me get away. Out in the country, by myself. I wanted the money to go. He and Mr. Evans never give me money, Nanny. Just things. All the things I want. Only I'm tired of things. I don't quite know what to do. When I think about it, I get very angry. I was very angry. Last night I was very angry. I've such funny ideas when I'm angry, Nanny. I mustn't get angry again, but I've got to get away. I don't blame you, Miss Genevieve, for being angry. You've been an angel all your life. All your life pinned up like a saint, with devils. You don't blame me, Nanny? No, lamb, not your nanny. Your nanny knows what it's been like for you. I know him, Miss Genevieve. I know he didn't give you the money. No, Nanny. He laughed at me. Laughed. He's a beast. That's what he is, Mississippi. He should have give it to you. And him going away himself. He was telling me only today. Into the country. What? Oh, Mississippi, I hate to say such things to you. He's going with that black-haired woman. The latest one. She is. He thinks she works too hard. He's taking her off for a rest. Is anything the matter? Aren't you well, darling? Genevieve Evans swayed dizzily for a second, her one hand reaching out blindly before her. The woman came quickly and took the hand between both of her hands and stroked it. Nanny, I'm sick. Nanny's darling, Nanny's pet. From somewhere in the house came the silvery, tinkling sound of a clock striking 7 times. I've got to go, Miss Genevieve, dear. All right, Nanny. The woman drew a chair up and pushed her gently into it. You'll not be telling him, miss? No, Nanny, no. The woman started for the door. Thank you, Miss Genevieve. Nanny, you said he was taking her, the black-haired one, away for a rest? Away into the country? With her hand on the doorknob, the woman turned. Yes. Why, lamb? Into the country. Genevieve Evans' voice was lifeless. Into the country where everything is quiet and big and clean. You said that, Nanny? I said the country, Miss Genevieve, dearie. Nanny. Her eyes were staring straight before her. I want to go. Lamb, darling. The woman stood undecided, but he wouldn't let me. He laughed at me. Nanny, he laughed. The woman made up her mind. Will Nanny stop with you a bit, Miss Genevieve, dearie? You said, Genevieve Evans' lifeless, monotonous voice went on. You said you wouldn't blame me for being angry. I get very angry, Nanny. Very angry. It brings all kinds of things to me when I get angry. His kind of things. Rotten things. And he's going to take her into the country, where everything's clean, and he won't let me go. God. Will I stay, Miss Genevieve? No, Nanny, go. Go quickly. Go now. Yes, Miss Genevieve. He'll be wanting to know where I am. Go, Nanny. She half rose from her chair. The door closed quietly behind the woman. Go. Genevieve Evans whispered. He's going into the country. He's taking that woman. He wouldn't let me. He wants to keep me here, just to feel his power, his filthy power. He's not the only one. She was muttering now. He's not the only one who can do things. Rotten, dirty things. His kind of things. She swayed to her feet. Her steps were short and uncertain. Her whole body reeled. Her face was blanched, drained of all color. Her fingers trembled wide spread at her sides. She was quivering from head to foot. Only her eyes were steady, her eyes wide and dilated that were riveted on the portrait hanging there above the wood-carved mantel. She backed toward the door, her eyes glued to the picture. Her shaking fingers, fumbling behind her, found the key and turned it, feeling her way with her hands, her distended eyes still fixed on that one thing. She got to the center table. It took her a while to pull open the drawer. Her breath came raspingly, as if she had been running. The old Venetian dagger with the cracked jeweled handle was between her fingers. Very slowly now she went toward the fireplace. The electric light flared over the colored gems that studded the handle of the dagger, giving out small quick rays of blue and red and green. "I'm angry," she whispered hoarsely. I'm very angry with you. You've no right to ruin my life and laugh. You did laugh at me." Her eyes stared up at the full, red face with the hard lines in it, up at the thick, sensual lips, up at the cunning eyes, at the ponderous, heavy-set figure, the powerful hands. "Why don't you laugh now? You aren't afraid, are you? You aren't afraid of anything? Not of me, are you, Daniel Dreher? You've done your best to keep me under your power. You stood behind Ernest to keep me under your power. You're not afraid of me? Why don't you laugh, Daniel Dreher?" Her right hand that held the dagger raised itself. "Laugh, Daniel Dreher. Laugh." She stood there under the portrait. Her left hand went stiffly out, feeling over the long cut in the painted arm. "Angry last night," she whispered. "And it hurt you, Daniel Dreher. I could hurt you." For a second her eyes went up to the dagger held there above her head, the dagger with the 1,000-colored gleams pointing from it. She gave a quick choking laugh. "I laugh at you, Daniel Dreher." With all her strength, she drove the dagger into the heart of the canvas. She staggered back to the center of the room. There was a gaping rent in the portrait. She laughed again, stupidly. Her laughter trailed off and stopped. She stood there waiting. Once she thought someone paused outside the door. Her hands were up across her eyes. Motionless, she waited. Suddenly, she gave a quick start. Out there in the hall, a telephone had rung. She heard her husband answer it. Her one distinct thought was that he must have been on his way out for dinner. His unbelieving cry came to her. "My God, it can't." Her fingers were pressed into her ears. She did not want to hear the rest. She knew it. That concludes the first 6 stories from the Scarecrow and Other Stories by G. Ranger Wormser. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through eerie fields and shadowy tales. But the adventure doesn't end here. There are more stories waiting to be told. I'll be reading the rest in the next video, so make sure you don't miss it. If you love the sound of rain and stories that stir your imagination, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Rainy Night Storyteller, and hit the notification bell. That way, you'll be the first to join me for the next chapter of this haunting collection. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again soon. Until then, stay curious and let the rain guide your dreams.